Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're easing into a subject that has sat quietly at dinner tables, celebrations, lonely evenings, awkward parties, and long human stories for a very long time. We're talking about alcohol, that familiar liquid with the remarkable habit of making itself seem simple right before it starts changing the brain in ways that are anything but simple. It can arrive in a glass with laughter, with ritual, with relief, with habit, with the strange promise that one small drink might soften the noise of a long day. And yet inside the head, the story is never just about taste or tradition. It is a story of signals, chemistry, timing, and a brain that begins adjusting almost from the very first sip. Before we wander further into that story, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what sort of hour this finds you in. Late evening has a way of making these questions feel a little closer, doesn't it? And if you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a gentle place to rest your thoughts for a while, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach other people who might want a calmer way to learn before sleep. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let the day loosen its grip a little, because the brain has a very particular way of meeting alcohol, and that meeting begins sooner than most people imagine. One reason alcohol is so easy to underestimate is that it does not arrive with the drama of a thunderstorm. It usually begins with something much smaller, a glass being set down, a first swallow, a warmth in the mouth, perhaps a little burn in the throat, then a pause. Nothing spectacular, nothing that feels like the opening move in a complex neurochemical event, but that is exactly what it is. From the moment alcohol enters the body, the brain is already on the receiving end of a substance that does not need much invitation. Ethanol, the type of alcohol found in drinks, is a small molecule. That matters because small molecules move more easily through the body than larger, more cumbersome ones. Alcohol does not need to be digested the way a meal does. It does not need to be broken into tiny nutritional pieces first. A portion of it is absorbed directly through the lining of the stomach, and much more is absorbed through the small intestine, where transfer into the bloodstream is especially efficient. Once it is in the blood, it circulates quickly, and the brain, being one of the most richly supplied organs in the body, meets it early. There is a protective system called the blood-brain barrier that keeps many substances from casually wandering into brain tissue. It is selective for good reason. The brain does not appreciate random chemical visitors, but alcohol is one of those substances small and chemically convenient enough to cross with relative ease, which means that a drink does not remain politely in the hand or the stomach or the social moment where it began. It enters the nervous system itself. That is the true start of the story. This speed helps explain something many people have noticed without necessarily thinking about the biology behind it. The first effects can feel surprisingly quick. A person may not yet look different, sound different, or even believe anything is happening, and yet the brain is already beginning to shift. Not all at once and not in every person the same way, because body size, sex, drinking speed, food in the stomach, genetics, sleep, stress, and prior alcohol exposure all change the experience. But even with those differences, the general pattern remains. Alcohol reaches the brain faster than the intuition would suggest, and once there, it begins influencing how nerve cells communicate. To understand why this matters, it helps to remember what the brain is doing when no alcohol is present. It is an electrical and chemical conversation on an astonishing scale. Billions of neurons are sending signals, receiving them, shaping them, dampening them, amplifying them, and coordinating everything from movement to memory to mood to self-control. That conversation depends on balance. Not moral balance, not personal balance, but literal signaling balance. Some systems excite activity, others calm it down. Some circuits help you focus, others help you rest. Some let you hold a thought in mind. Others let you stop yourself from saying that thought out loud at a family dinner. A healthy waking brain is not simply switched on, it is tuned. Alcohol does not create a brand new brain state from nothing. Instead, it leans on systems that are already there and pushes them out of their usual range. One of the earliest reasons a drink can feel relaxing is that alcohol tends to strengthen inhibitory signaling in the brain. In plain language, that means it helps some of the slowdown signals have a bigger effect. At the same time, it can reduce certain forms of excitatory signaling, the kinds that usually help keep the brain alert, precise, and well coordinated. So from the very start, alcohol is not adding wisdom or courage or social brilliance. It is changing the balance between braking and accelerating inside the nervous system. This is where the experience becomes a little deceptive. Many early effects of alcohol are often described in positive human terms: relaxed, looser, more open, less tense, a bit lighter. And that description is understandable because that is often how it feels from the inside. But under the surface, the brain is already becoming less careful in how it regulates itself. The same process that makes a person feel less self-conscious can also make them less precise. The same chemistry that softens anxiety a little can also soften judgment. This is one of alcohol's oldest tricks. It makes impairment feel, at first, like improvement. That matters because the front part of the brain, especially the prefrontal regions, plays a major role in self-monitoring, planning, inhibition, and decision-making. These are the systems that help a person pause before acting, read a room well, weigh risk, and notice when they may not be functioning at their best. Alcohol begins weakening those systems early, which produces a very inconvenient result. The part of the brain that would normally warn you that your brain is becoming less sharp is itself becoming less sharp. It is a little like having your home smoke detector slowly lose battery right when something starts burning in the kitchen. Not ideal. The person may feel more confident while becoming less accurate, more expressive while becoming less discerning, more certain while becoming less reliable. This helps explain why alcohol can be socially powerful. Human beings spend a great deal of mental energy monitoring themselves. Am I saying the right thing? Do I sound awkward? Did that joke land badly? Am I being judged? The sober brain can become quite busy with self-evaluation, especially in stressful or unfamiliar social settings. Alcohol dampens some of that internal friction. And when the tension drops, the change can feel like relief. A shy person may speak more easily. A worried person may feel, for a while, that their thoughts have stopped pressing so hard against them. A tired person may feel less burdened by the weight of the day. In those early moments, alcohol can seem like it is giving something back, but chemically it is not creating clarity. It is reducing restraint. That distinction matters. The brain under the influence of alcohol is not necessarily becoming more honest, more charming, or more emotionally deep. It is becoming less filtered. Sometimes that produces warmth and laughter. Sometimes it produces repetition, poor judgment, irritation, or tears that seemed nowhere close a half hour earlier. A brain with weaker brakes does not always travel in noble directions. Another reason the first stage of drinking can feel so persuasive is timing. Alcohol does not hit every system with identical speed or identical strength. The circuits involved in social inhibition and self-consciousness can loosen before the heavier effects on balance, speech and coordination become obvious. This creates a window where a person feels subjectively better before they look objectively impaired. In that window, alcohol gains much of its reputation as a helpful social companion. It seems to take the edge off without yet presenting the full bill. Later systems, however, are already on the way. There is also something deeply human about the ritual around the first drink. Biology never arrives alone. Context comes with it. The room matters. The people matter. The expectation matters. The brain is not a machine that responds only to molecules and ignores meaning. If someone believes a drink marks the start of rest, celebration, belonging, or emotional release, the experience can be shaped by that expectation before the chemistry has even fully unfolded. The body begins to anticipate what the substance has meant before, This is one reason the first drink after a hard day can feel almost symbolic. Not because the brain has solved anything, but because it has learned an association. Glass in hand, shoulders drop, evening begins. Human brains are very good at turning repeated pairings into felt realities. That learned anticipation is powerful, and it becomes part of alcohol's hold over behaviour long before physical dependence enters the picture. A person may not yet be drinking heavily, may not think of themselves as relying on anything, and yet the brain may already be using alcohol as a shortcut between one emotional state and another. From tension to ease, from awkwardness to talkativeness, from loneliness to softness, from celebration to permission. The chemistry starts in the bloodstream, but the pattern settles into memory and expectation. Meanwhile, the liver has already entered the scene, because alcohol does not remain in the body forever. The liver is responsible for metabolizing most of it, using enzymes to break ethanol down step by step. But the liver works at a limited pace. This is another important point, because many people speak of holding their alcohol as though it were mostly a matter of character or talent. In reality, the body clears alcohol gradually, and there is no trick that turns the liver into a race car. Coffee does not suddenly sober the brain. A cold shower does not pull alcohol out of neural tissue. Regret at 1:20 in the morning does not accelerate enzyme activity. Time remains stubbornly important. Because the body clears alcohol more slowly than many people consume it, blood alcohol concentration can continue rising even after someone stops drinking for a bit. This surprises people. They may feel stable at one moment and noticeably more impaired later, not because a new drink appeared from nowhere, but because alcohol already in the digestive system kept getting absorbed. The brain is therefore not responding only to what was just consumed, but also to what is still on its way. It is rather like inviting several guests into a house and forgetting that some of them are still in the hallway taking off their coats. Food changes the pace of this process significantly. Drinking on an empty stomach generally leads to faster absorption and stronger early effects, because alcohol reaches the small intestine more quickly. Drinking with food slows things down. The chemistry is the same, but the timing changes, and timing in biology often changes the whole experience. This is one reason 2 evenings with the same number of drinks can feel completely different. People often interpret that difference emotionally or socially when the explanation may be partly physiological. Sleep deprivation, stress hormones, hydration, recent meals, and speed of drinking all alter how the same substance lands in the same brain. There is also individual biology. Some people have genetic variations affecting the enzymes that metabolize alcohol. Some have different sensitivity in brain systems alcohol interacts with. Some feel sedated quickly. Some feel stimulated before sedation arrives. Some flush, feel sick, or develop headaches rapidly. Some seem outwardly composed even while cognition is more impaired than they realize. This variety can make alcohol socially confusing because people compare themselves to others using visible signs that are not always trustworthy. But the fact that one person appears less affected does not mean their brain is being spared. It may simply mean their outward style of impairment is different. And then there is dose. The brain's response to alcohol is not an all-or-nothing switch, it is progressive. At lower levels, the earliest changes often involve relaxation, reduced inhibition, mild euphoria, and subtle slowing of reaction time. Increase the dose, and speech, coordination, attention, and judgment become more obviously compromised. Increase it further, and the risks become serious. Memory can fail. Nausea rises. Balance deteriorates. Breathing can become dangerously suppressed at very high levels. A substance that began the evening looking sociable can become medically dangerous with far less ceremony than people expect. The body does not care whether the drink was expensive, artisanal, festive, traditional, or consumed to a very good soundtrack. Ethanol remains ethanol. Still, The opening phase is where alcohol earns its place in human habit, and it earns it by being persuasive rather than brutal. It does not usually begin by frightening the brain, it begins by negotiating with it. It says, very quietly, perhaps we do not need quite so much vigilance tonight. Perhaps we can loosen our grip a little. Perhaps the room is friendlier than it seemed. Perhaps the thoughts do not need to be so loud. And because those promises touch genuine human needs, the brain often listens. The difficulty is that alcohol cannot selectively lower only the burdens a person wishes to lower. It cannot remove anxiety while preserving perfect judgment, relax the body while protecting deep sleep, soften social fear while leaving memory untouched, or create confidence without also increasing impulsivity. The brain is too interconnected for that sort of precision. Once alcohol is in circulation, it is interacting with systems that overlap and influence one another. The calm, the blur, the warmth, the misstep, the laugh that is a little too loud, the sentence one should probably not have finished, the growing sense that the evening is somehow easier and less exacting than sober life usually is, all of these belong to the same unfolding process. That is why the first sip matters, not because it determines everything that follows, but because it begins the shift before most people consciously register that a shift has begun. The brain is already changing while the person may still feel almost entirely themselves. In fact, that is one of the most interesting parts of the whole story. Alcohol often works by altering the brain in ways that preserve the feeling of being normal for longer than normal function is actually being preserved. A person still feels like the author of their thoughts even while the editing has weakened, still feels balanced while reaction time has slowed, still feels clear while the machinery of attention has grown less precise. So when people say alcohol sneaks up on you, that phrase is more accurate than it sounds. It does not arrive as a stranger kicking in the door. It arrives as a familiar guest, sits down quietly in the brain's communication networks, and begins rearranging the tone of the room. First the signals soften, then the filters loosen. Then the person who thought nothing much was happening may discover that quite a lot has been happening all along, and that is where the next part of the story begins, because once alcohol is inside the brain, it starts changing the chemical conversation itself, especially in the systems that slow things down and speed things up, and those two forces will carry us further into what the brain is actually experiencing. There is something almost misleadingly ordinary about a first sip of alcohol. It rarely announces itself like a grand event. It does not usually arrive with dramatic music or a warning label glowing in mid-air. More often it begins in a social pause, in the clink of glass, in a toast, in the little ritual of lifting something cool or warm to the mouth and swallowing. The moment is so familiar that it can feel harmless by default, as though the body will treat it like any other drink and sort it out quietly in the background. But the body does not treat alcohol like tea or orange juice or water after a long day. From the moment it enters, the brain is already much closer to the story than most people imagine, and the speed of that connection is one of the reasons alcohol can be so easy to underestimate. When people think about substances reaching the brain, they often picture a long and complicated journey, as though anything swallowed must sit around for a while in the stomach, waiting politely for permission to matter. That is true for many things. A full meal takes time to process. Nutrients must be broken down. Digestion is work. But alcohol, chemically speaking, is a rather different visitor. Ethanol is a small molecule, simple enough in structure that the body can absorb it quickly. It does not need to be dismantled into tiny pieces in the same way food does. It begins entering the bloodstream not long after it is consumed, and once it is in the blood, the distance between a drink and the brain becomes surprisingly short. Some alcohol is absorbed directly through the lining of the stomach. Not all of it, but enough to begin the process early. Then, as the drink moves into the small intestine, absorption becomes even more efficient. The small intestine is very good at moving substances into the bloodstream. It has a large surface area, rich blood supply, and a general attitude of, yes, send that along. So alcohol does not linger in the digestive tract as a passive guest. It moves. And because it moves quickly, the first biological effects are often underway before a person would describe themselves as drunk, impaired, or even particularly changed at all. That is part of what makes the first phase so deceptive. The brain does not wait for a person's official declaration that something is happening. It begins responding the moment alcohol concentration in the blood begins to rise. That means the nervous system can already be shifting while the person is still arranging their chair, continuing a conversation, or thinking they feel basically the same. And in a sense they do feel basically the same, because the earliest changes are subtle. But subtle does not mean trivial. Some of the most important effects of alcohol begin before the person would give them much attention. The bloodstream, for its part, is not selective about where it goes. Blood circulates everywhere it needs to, delivering oxygen and nutrients, removing waste, serving the endless demands of living tissue. The brain is one of the most richly supplied organs in the body because it is metabolically expensive. Even sitting quietly and doing very little that looks impressive from the outside, the brain is burning energy with remarkable enthusiasm. So once alcohol is in the circulation, the brain is among the early recipients. Now, the brain does have a protective filter called the blood-brain barrier, which sounds like something built by a civilization that was very serious about border control. In many ways, it is. This barrier helps prevent certain toxins, pathogens, and large or poorly suited molecules from drifting into brain tissue without proper clearance. It is not a wall in the brick-and-mortar sense, but a finely regulated system of cells and transport rules that helps protect the central nervous system. Many substances cannot cross it easily. Alcohol can. That is a crucial detail. Ethanol is both small and chemically able to pass through this barrier with relative ease, which means that what began as a drink in the mouth soon becomes a chemical presence in the brain itself. And once there, alcohol does not sit quietly in a corner admiring the architecture. It begins interfering with the way neurons communicate. The brain works through electrochemical signaling. Neurons fire, neurotransmitters are released, receptors respond, circuits coordinate. Everything you do depends on this ongoing exchange. Walking, speaking, remembering where you left your keys, recognizing a face, stopping yourself from sending a message you would regret. All of it depends on patterns of neural communication happening at high speed and in careful balance. Alcohol alters that balance. It is not waiting for some magical threshold where it becomes real. Its reality begins with concentration, and concentration begins rising early. One reason people often misjudge the timing is that alcohol's subjective effects do not always match its pharmacological progress in a simple way. In other words, the chemistry can be advancing faster than the feeling. A person may say, "I don't feel it yet," while their blood alcohol level is very much on its way upward. This happens partly because absorption continues after the drink is finished. Alcohol already in the stomach and intestine keeps moving into the bloodstream over time, so the body is not responding only to what has been consumed, but also to what has been consumed and not yet fully absorbed. That creates a lag between intake and peak effect. It is rather like mailing yourself several mildly bad decisions and being surprised when they keep arriving. This delay matters because it encourages overconfidence. Someone may have one drink, wait a short while, feel mostly normal, then have another and perhaps another, assuming that the effects should have fully declared themselves by now if they were going to. But the body is still catching up. Blood alcohol concentration may continue rising for quite a while, especially if drinking is quick or food is minimal. The person is making decisions in the present based on a brain that has not yet fully revealed what the earlier decisions are going to do. It is a biologically awkward arrangement, though a very common one. Food plays a large role in how quickly this process unfolds. If alcohol is consumed on an empty stomach, it generally reaches the small intestine more quickly, where absorption is faster and more extensive. That can lead to a more rapid rise in blood alcohol levels and a stronger sense that the drink hit suddenly. On the other hand, food in the stomach slows gastric emptying, which means alcohol enters the small intestine more gradually. The same number of drinks can therefore produce very different early experiences depending on whether they arrived alongside a meal, a small snack, or nothing more substantial than optimism. This is one reason people can be caught off guard. They are not always comparing like with like. A drink at a dinner table and a drink on an empty stomach late at night are not the same event to the body. Body size and composition matter too. Alcohol distributes primarily in body water, not body fat. So two people of the same weight can still experience different concentrations depending on their body composition. In general, people with less total body water relative to the amount consumed may reach higher blood alcohol concentrations more quickly. Sex differences often play a role here as well, not because biology enjoys making things complicated for sport, but because differences in average body composition, hormone patterns, and certain metabolic factors can change how alcohol is processed and distributed. As a result, the same amount consumed in the same amount of time does not affect every body in the same way. Then there is metabolism, which many people imagine as a flexible and negotiable system, perhaps open to persuasion if one believes in oneself strongly enough. It is not. Most alcohol is metabolized in the liver, where enzymes begin converting ethanol into acetaldehyde and then into acetate, which the body can further process. This happens at a limited rate. The liver does not suddenly become dramatically faster because someone drank water, took a walk, made a promise, or stared into the distance with real sincerity. The clearance of alcohol is relatively steady compared with the speed at which people often consume it. That imbalance is important. The body can absorb alcohol much faster than it can eliminate it, so if drinks are coming in quickly, concentration rises faster than the liver can bring it back down. Because of this, the first sip is not just the start of a feeling. It is the start of a race the liver is almost guaranteed to lose if the pace is quick enough. The bloodstream fills, the brain receives, the liver works but not fast enough to prevent early accumulation, and while that is happening, the person may still be in the pleasant stretch where nothing feels especially serious. This is one reason alcohol has such a strong reputation for sneaking up on people. It does not really sneak. It proceeds quite openly according to pharmacokinetics. But because subjective awareness lags behind the underlying rise in concentration, it feels sneaky from the inside. The earliest effects on the brain often involve subtle changes in inhibition, attention, and sensory interpretation. Alcohol begins influencing systems involved in slowing neural activity and dampening excitation, which can create the feeling of softening tension or loosening social restraint. This is one reason the first drink can feel so friendly. The brain's internal chatter becomes a little less sharp around the edges. Self-monitoring may become less intense. Anxiety may ease a little. The room may seem warmer, the conversation easier, one's own remarks more clever than strict later review would support. All of this can happen while blood alcohol concentration is still relatively low, and because the early effects often feel subjectively pleasant, they encourage the mistaken idea that alcohol is helping the brain function better. It is not helping the brain function better. It is changing the balance of what the brain is doing, often by weakening the very systems that would make a person more cautious or self-aware about the change. This is the inconvenient feature of early impairment. The circuits involved in judgment and self-monitoring are among the ones being affected, so the brain is losing some of its ability to notice the loss of ability. A person may feel more at ease and more confident not because their thoughts have become more accurate, but because the machinery of doubt and restraint has been dialed down. This is where the first phase becomes socially powerful. Human beings are on average rather busy monitoring themselves. We check our tone, we check our posture, we wonder if we sound odd, we review our own sentences while still speaking them. In many situations, that constant supervision is tiring. Alcohol reduces some of it. As a result, the first sip can feel less like the arrival of a drug and more like the easing of a burden. A person may not say, "My inhibitory signaling is changing." They say, "I'm finally relaxing," which is understandable. But the chemistry beneath that feeling is not selective. The same process that makes social interaction feel easier can also reduce caution, blur timing, and loosen control in ways that will become clearer with dose. Another complication is expectation. The brain is not just a chemical target, it is also a prediction machine. If a person has learned over time that the first drink marks the beginning of rest, fun, intimacy, or relief, the body may begin shifting in anticipation before the alcohol has even fully circulated. Ritual matters. Context matters. The smell, the setting, the social cues, the hour of the day, all can shape how the first sip feels. This means that some of what people experience early is not only the direct pharmacology of alcohol, but also the learned response built around it. The brain has seen this scene before. It knows the script. Glass appears, shoulders loosen, evening starts. Biology and memory meet at the rim of the glass. That learned response can make alcohol seem even faster than it already is. Part of the effect is real chemistry. Part is the brain preparing for what real chemistry has meant in the past. Together, they create a powerful sense that a state is changing and changing with purpose. The first sip becomes more than intake. It becomes a cue, a signal, the beginning of a familiar internal transition. This is one reason alcohol habits can become deeply ingrained long before anyone would describe themselves as dependent. Repetition teaches the brain not only what alcohol does, but when to expect it and what emotional job it is supposed to perform. Of course, not everyone experiences the early phase in exactly the same way. Some people feel relaxed, some feel energized, some become more talkative, some become quiet, some feel sleepy almost immediately, others seem lifted before they later become tired. Part of this depends on dose and timing, part on personality and context, and part on individual biology. But the variation should not hide the common mechanism. In all cases, alcohol is getting into the brain quickly and beginning to alter signal processing in networks that regulate mood, inhibition, attention, movement, and memory. And this is worth emphasizing because the brain has no special category called just one harmless drink in the pharmacological sense. It has concentration, receptors, circuits, and responses. The social meaning of a drink may vary enormously. A wedding toast, a quiet beer after work, a glass of wine with dinner, a strong cocktail on an empty stomach in a noisy bar, all of these may feel culturally distinct. But at the neural level, ethanol is ethanol. The first sip begins a process governed by absorption, distribution, metabolism, and brain sensitivity, not by whether the lighting was flattering or the playlist was excellent. This is also why common myths about sobering up are so persistent and so unhelpful. Coffee may make a person feel more awake, but it does not remove alcohol from the bloodstream. A shower may feel clarifying, but it does not change the liver's rate of metabolism. Fresh air can be pleasant, but it is not an enzyme. The brain can be both stimulated and impaired at once, which is part of the danger. Someone who feels more alert after caffeine may believe they are functioning better when the underlying alcohol level has not meaningfully changed. The first sip started a chemical process, and that process proceeds according to biology, not folk wisdom. What makes all of this especially important is that the first phase often carries the least visible warning signs. Slowed reaction time can begin before overt clumsiness. Reduced inhibition can begin before slurred speech. Shifts in judgment can begin before a person looks obviously intoxicated. The person still appears recognizably themselves, and from the inside they often feel recognizably themselves too. Yet the precision of the system is already being altered. The brain is becoming a little less careful, a little less exact, a little more willing to lean on feeling and habit rather than restraint and evaluation. Sometimes that looks like laughter, sometimes it looks like risk, sometimes it looks like both at once. So the first sip is not just a beginning in the casual sense, it is a biological turning point. Alcohol enters the body quickly, reaches the bloodstream quickly, crosses into the brain quickly, and starts shifting neural communication earlier than most people would guess. That speed is part of its appeal and part of its risk. It feels familiar before it feels serious. It feels social before it feels pharmacological. It feels like a small event outside the body while becoming a larger event inside it. And once alcohol has arrived in the brain, it does something especially important next. It begins leaning on two of the nervous system's major chemical forces, one that tends to calm activity down and one that tends to keep it active and alert. The balance between those two helps explain why alcohol can feel relaxing, foggy, sedating, and strangely persuasive all at once, which is where the deeper chemistry starts to come into view as the brain continues adjusting to what that first sip set in motion. When alcohol begins changing the brain, one of the most important things it does is also one of the least dramatic sounding. It changes how strongly certain signals are allowed to move through the nervous system. That may not sound especially thrilling at first. It lacks the flair of a lightning strike or the romance of some mysterious secret ingredient. But in the brain, signal control is everything. You're awake, calm, focused, sleepy, impulsive, coordinated, forgetful, alert or foggy, because neurons are constantly sending messages, and other neurons are constantly deciding how much those messages should matter. Some signals push activity forward, others put a hand on the shoulder and say, "Not so fast." A functioning brain depends on the balance between those forces. Alcohol steps into that balancing act almost immediately, and one of the clearest ways it does so is by leaning on two major players in brain chemistry, GABA and glutamate. Now, these names sound a bit like the sort of guests who might arrive at a very technical dinner party and begin discussing receptor subtypes before dessert, but their roles are much easier to understand than their names might suggest. Glutamate is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter. In broad terms, it helps neurons activate one another. It supports alertness, learning, memory formation, sensory processing, and the general business of keeping the brain switched on and responsive. If the brain were a city at midday, glutamate would be part of the traffic system keeping everything moving, the lights changing, the people walking briskly, the shops open, the buses somehow late, even though everyone insists the schedule is quite clear. GABA, short for gamma-aminobutyric acid, does nearly the opposite in many situations. It is the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. It helps reduce neural activity. It makes signals less likely to keep spreading when they do not need to. It prevents the whole system from becoming too noisy, too fast, too overexcited. If glutamate helps press the accelerator, GABA helps press the brake. And just like in an actual car, the important thing is not that one always wins. The important thing is that both are working in proportion. Too much excitation and the brain becomes unstable. Too much inhibition and the brain becomes sluggish, dulled, less responsive. A healthy mind depends on a moving balance between the two. Alcohol affects both sides of this balance, and that's a large part of why it feels the way it does. One of alcohol's early actions is to strengthen the effect of GABA at certain receptors, especially GABA-A receptors. That means alcohol makes some of the brain's inhibitory signals more powerful. The same GABA that already helps calm neural activity becomes more effective when alcohol is around. Signals that might otherwise keep moving are more likely to be dampened. Neurons become less excitable, circuits become less sharp. The whole system begins leaning towards slowdown. At the same time, alcohol reduces the activity of certain glutamate receptors, especially a class called NMDA receptors, which are deeply involved in excitation, memory, and learning. So alcohol is not just pressing harder on the brake, it is also easing off the accelerator. It is a double move, and that double move matters. The brain is being calmed from one side and weakened from the other. More inhibition, less excitation. This is why alcohol can produce a feeling that many people describe as relaxing or smoothing. The nervous system is literally being made less active, less exact, less ready to fire on all cylinders. That early sense of calm is therefore not an emotional miracle, it is chemistry. And like many chemically induced states, it can be persuasive precisely because it touches something people genuinely want. A great many people spend a good portion of their days overstimulated, overstressed, overthinking, or simply tired of being so tightly wound. The modern brain is often asked to stay alert for far longer than it seems especially happy about. Notifications, obligations, noise, self-monitoring, worry, unfinished tasks, future plans, old regrets, all of it keeps mental activity going. So when alcohol strengthens inhibitory signaling and weakens excitatory signaling, the result can feel like relief. Thoughts may seem less crowded, tension may feel less insistent, the mind may stop gripping itself so tightly. But there is a reason that chemically slowing the brain is not the same as truly restoring it. The calm alcohol creates is broad and blunt. It does not soothe only anxiety while preserving perfect thinking. It does not selectively quiet stress while carefully protecting attention, memory, coordination, and judgment. The brain is too interconnected for that. Once alcohol begins shifting GABA and glutamate activity, many systems are affected together. The same chemistry that makes someone feel less socially tense can also make them less precise with language. The same chemistry that softens nervousness can also weaken self-control. The same chemistry that gives a sense of ease can also begin the process that makes memories less reliable later in the evening. This is why alcohol's first gift often contains its later cost. It feels calming because the brain is becoming less active in important ways. That reduction in activity can be pleasant at first. For a while, a quieter brain can feel like a kinder brain. But quieting is not always the same thing as helping. You could make a noisy room feel calm by dimming the lights and asking everyone to whisper. But if you also turned down the smoke alarm, slowed the exit signs, and made it harder for people to find the door, the calm would come with disadvantages. The brain under alcohol is a bit like that. Less noise, yes, less sharpness too. The prefrontal cortex is one of the regions that particularly feels the consequences of this shift. This front part of the brain helps with planning, judgment, impulse control, social restraint, and the ability to pause before acting. It is involved in weighing consequences, reading situations accurately, and deciding that maybe the sentence in your head does not need to become a sentence in the room. When alcohol strengthens inhibition and weakens excitatory signaling, prefrontal function becomes less effective. That is one reason a person may feel more relaxed and more willing to speak, while actually becoming less skilled at assessing whether speaking is wise. This is one of alcohol's cleverer biological tricks. The brain systems that help a person judge impairment are themselves being impaired, so the person often feels not only calm, but also oddly reassured by that calm. They may feel more natural, more open, more themselves. Yet in reality, what often changes first is not authenticity but inhibition. The edit button is softer, the filter is thinner. The sense that one should perhaps slow down, reconsider, or remain slightly less enthusiastic about a questionable idea grows weaker. A person can become more confident while becoming less competent, which is an unfortunate pairing, but a very common one. Now, GABA and glutamate are not the only chemicals involved in alcohol's effects. Dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and other systems play roles too, especially in reward, mood, and reinforcement. But GABA and glutamate are central to understanding the basic feel of alcohol in the brain, because they shape the overall tone of neural activity. They help explain why alcohol often begins by making the world seem softer around the edges. The room is still the room. The conversation is still the conversation. But the nervous system is responding with less force and less vigilance. This softer quality can make alcohol feel almost therapeutic in the moment, and that is one reason people return to it. Someone whose mind feels habitually fast, crowded, or tense may experience the GABA-boosting, glutamate-dampening effects of alcohol as a kind of temporary answer. For an hour or two, the internal volume drops, but the brain notices this interference, and brains are adaptive organs. They do not simply sit back and allow major chemical changes to repeat forever without responding. If alcohol is used often enough, the brain begins adjusting to its presence. That adjustment becomes important later, because what feels like calm in the short term can eventually teach the brain to compensate in ways that increase tension, restlessness, and dependence when alcohol is absent. But even before we get to repeated use, the immediate chemistry tells us something important. Alcoholic calm is not neutral. It is purchased through altered signaling. It is also worth noticing that calm can be a misleading word because the first effects of alcohol do not always look sleepy. A person may become more talkative, more animated, even more energetic after drinking. That can make people think alcohol is acting as a stimulant, but much of this apparent stimulation is really disinhibition. The brain's braking systems are being weakened in ways that allow behavior to become freer, louder, less restrained. The person is not necessarily more alert in the deep neurological sense. They are often less inhibited. That distinction matters. A car rolling downhill with weak brakes can look lively, but that does not make it well controlled. Meanwhile, glutamate suppression affects more than mood and general alertness. Glutamate is deeply involved in synaptic plasticity, which is the brain's ability to strengthen connections during learning and memory formation. NMDA, receptors in particular, are crucial for laying down new memories. When alcohol interferes with these receptors, the brain becomes less effective at turning ongoing experience into stable memory. This is one reason memory problems can begin before a person loses consciousness or seems dramatically intoxicated. The system for recording events is already being weakened. The evening may continue, the conversation may continue, the person may continue speaking and moving around and later insist they seemed fine, but the brain may already be doing a poorer job of storing what is happening. That is an unsettling feature of alcohol's chemistry. It can reduce anxiety and precision at the same time. It can calm the mind while making it less able to build reliable memory. It can create the impression of emotional ease while quietly interfering with the machinery that would later allow a person to recall what they said, what they agreed to, or why exactly they thought telling that long story for the third time was an excellent use of everyone's evening. GABA and glutamate are not responsible for every consequence of drinking, but they sit very close to the center of this transition from relaxed to impaired. The cerebellum and brainstem also begin feeling these broader changes as alcohol levels rise. The cerebellum helps coordinate movement and balance. The brainstem regulates essential functions including breathing, arousal, and some autonomic control. As inhibitory signaling increases and excitatory signaling decreases, movements become less fine-tuned. Timing slips. Speech can become slower or less precise. Balance begins to wobble. At higher levels, sedation deepens. This is not because the body has decided to be theatrical. It is because systems that depend on carefully timed neural communication are operating under altered chemical rules. And yet, from the inside, this often unfolds gradually enough that the person remains convinced they are mostly in command. This is one of the strange social features of alcohol. The subjective sense of control declines less quickly than actual control. GABA enhancement can feel comfortable. Glutamate reduction can feel smooth. The person does not receive a loud inner message saying, "Your signal integration is worsening." Instead, they feel, perhaps, a bit more at ease, a bit less burdened by self-awareness, a bit more willing to carry on. The internal report is flattering. The external reality becomes less so over time. The chemistry also helps explain why alcohol and other depressant substances can be such a risky combination. If alcohol is already increasing inhibitory signaling and lowering excitatory drive, adding another substance that also slows the brain, such as benzodiazepines or opioids, can push the system much further toward dangerous suppression. Breathing, arousal, coordination, and consciousness all depend on neural activity staying within survivable limits. One drug pressing harder on the brake is one thing. Several doing it together is another. The brain is remarkably capable, but it is not infinitely negotiable. Another point that often surprises people is that the pleasantness of alcohol's calming effect does not mean the brain experiences it as a form of rest. in the way it experiences real restoration. Sleep, for example, is highly organized. The brain cycles through stages, certain circuits quiet while others perform housekeeping, memory processing, and metabolic regulation. Alcohol's GABA-heavy slowing is not equivalent to that. It can make a person drowsy, certainly. It can make falling asleep easier at first, but sedation is not the same as healthy sleep architecture, just as being knocked onto a sofa is not the same as a well-planned holiday. The brain may look quieter from the outside while actually being less able to do some of the things real rest is supposed to accomplish. For many people, that is part of alcohol's enduring confusion. The immediate chemistry feels simple. I drank. I relaxed. But the actual biology is less elegant. I drank. My inhibitory signaling increased. My excitatory signaling decreased. My self-monitoring weakened. My reaction time slowed. My memory systems became less efficient. My coordination began shifting, and the sense of calm I experienced was partly the feeling of a brain becoming less exact. That is not quite the slogan beverage companies like to embroider on picnic blankets, but it is closer to the truth. There is also an emotional layer to all this. People do not drink only for chemistry. They drink for relief, ritual, belonging, habit, celebration, curiosity, loneliness, boredom, reward, and because human beings are very good at turning molecules into meanings. GABA and glutamate do not explain the whole human story of alcohol, but they explain a great deal of why the substance feels so persuasive. If a drink reliably lowers internal tension, even temporarily and imperfectly, the brain learns that pattern. It remembers. It begins to expect that calm when the glass appears. And because the calm feels immediate while the costs often arrive later, the lesson can sink in very deeply. But the brain is never just passively enjoying these changes, it is tracking them. It is adjusting receptor sensitivity, network balance, and the general set point of activity in response to repeated exposure. Even in the short term, after the earlier smoothness, there can be drift. The same chemistry that softens the mind can, with more alcohol, make it duller, clumsier, and less coherent. The transition is not a clean line, it is a slope. And because GABA and glutamate sit so close to the nervous system's core balancing act, altering them has wide effects. There is no tidy boundary where calm ends and impairment begins. More often, calm is simply the beginning of impairment experienced pleasantly enough that the person does not mind it at first. This helps explain why alcohol has such a complicated reputation. People are not entirely wrong when they say it calms them. It often does. But the mechanism of that calm is inseparable from the mechanism of disruption. The soothing and the slowing belong to the same act. The sense of ease and the erosion of control begin together. Alcohol does not offer peace in a separate package from impairment. It blends them. It makes the change feel kind before it becomes obviously costly. So when we talk about alcohol slowing the signals, we are really talking about a brain being nudged out of its working balance. GABA is given more influence, glutamate is given less. The result is a nervous system that becomes less driven, less vigilant, less exact, and often less distressed in the moment. That can feel like a blessing after a difficult day, but the brain pays attention to what helps it feel briefly better, and once reward enters the picture, another layer of the story begins to unfold because the chemistry of calm is only part of why alcohol is so compelling. Soon enough, the brain's reward systems start joining the conversation, and with them comes the warm early lift that makes alcohol feel not only quieter, but strangely appealing from the inside. One reason alcohol has held such a durable place in human life is that it does not arrive in the brain as pure heaviness. If it did, its story would be much simpler. People would taste it, feel vaguely slowed and unimpressed, and probably move on to something more pleasant, perhaps tea, perhaps sparkling water, perhaps the ancient and noble act of going home early. But alcohol often begins with something gentler and more inviting than that. Alongside the slowing effects we've already wandered through, there is often an early lift, a shift in mood, a small bloom of pleasure or ease that makes the whole experience feel less like a sedative event and more like a reward. This part of the story matters a great deal because substances that make people feel only dull are easier to leave alone. Substances that make people feel briefly better, brighter, or more warmly connected are much harder for the brain to forget. To understand that early good feeling, we need to talk about dopamine, which is perhaps one of the most talked about brain chemicals in modern life, and also one of the most routinely misunderstood. Dopamine is often described as the pleasure molecule, as though it were a tiny internal metrody strolling through the nervous system announcing that something delightful has arrived. That is not entirely wrong, but it is not quite right either. Dopamine is involved in reward, yes, but more precisely it is involved in motivation, reinforcement, salience, and learning. It helps the brain notice that something matters. It helps stamp certain experiences as worth repeating. It is less the whole feeling of pleasure itself, and more the system that says, pay attention, this is important. Remember how you got here, maybe do that again. This is why dopamine is so central to the story of alcohol. Alcohol does not simply make the brain slower and less inhibited. It also engages reward circuits, especially those involving the mesolimbic dopamine system. That phrase sounds rather formal, but the basic idea is straightforward. There is a network in the brain that helps identify rewarding experiences and connect them to behavior. Key parts of this network include the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, names which sound as though they ought to come with a small Latin grammar lesson, but their job is human and familiar. They help the brain register when something feels good, novel, relieving, exciting, or worth seeking again. When alcohol enters this system, dopamine activity can increase. Not in a simple, cartoonish way, every time for every person in exactly the same pattern, but enough to matter. The result is that the first phase of drinking can feel not only calmer, but also more rewarding. The room may seem friendlier, conversation may seem easier. The person may feel warmer, more open, more interested, more willing to remain where they are and continue doing what they are doing. This is important because the brain is not merely experiencing alcohol as a chemical that slows the signals. It is beginning to classify alcohol as something linked to reward. This partly explains why the first drink of an evening can feel different from the third or fourth. There is often a distinctive moment at the beginning when tension loosens and mood seems to lift, sometimes before more obvious impairment has set in. That early lift can be subtle. It may not look like intense joy or wild excitement. More often it feels like a gentle improvement in the tone of the world. One's own thoughts seem less abrasive. The social environment seems slightly more manageable. A small wave of pleasure, or at least relief, passes through. And because human beings are not indifferent to relief, the brain takes notice. Relief, in fact, is one of the most powerful forms of reward. People often imagine reward only as the addition of something pleasant, such as sweetness on the tongue or laughter in a room. But the removal of something unpleasant can be just as reinforcing, sometimes even more so. If a person has been tense, lonely, restless, anxious, overworked, or tired of their own thoughts, then alcohol's early effects may feel rewarding not because they create wild happiness, but because they subtract discomfort. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to this. If an action leads to less distress, the nervous system often learns that action quickly. It stores the association. It becomes easier to repeat. This is where alcohol's chemistry begins to blend with personal history. The same drink can mean slightly different things to different brains, depending on what the brain has been carrying into the moment. For one person, the lift may feel social. For another, it may feel like relief from self-consciousness. For another, it may feel like the softening of sadness or stress. For someone else, it may feel like a cue that work is over and private time has finally begun. Dopamine does not operate in a vacuum. It works alongside memory, context, expectation, and the body's ongoing emotional state. So alcohol's early appeal is never only about the molecule itself. it is also about what the brain learns the molecule means. This is one reason expectation can shape the first good feeling so strongly. If the brain has repeatedly experienced alcohol in settings associated with connection, rest, celebration, or escape, then simply beginning the ritual can start nudging reward circuits before the chemistry is fully developed. The smell, the glass, the room, the time of day, the sound of familiar voices all can act as cues. The brain begins preparing itself for a known pattern. In a sense, it is not only responding to alcohol, it is responding to the promise of alcohol. And promises, once learned, can be deeply motivating. That learned promise is not trivial. It is the beginning of reinforcement. Reinforcement means that a behavior becomes more likely to happen again because it was followed by something rewarding or relieving. If a drink reliably leads to a gentle lift in mood, then the brain starts linking drinking behavior with reward. The link does not need to be dramatic to be strong. It can be built through repetition, through the same evening pattern unfolding over weeks or years. Sit down, pour drink, exhale, feel better. Even if the better is small and temporary, the loop can become very deeply ingrained. Now, alcohol's relationship with dopamine is not identical to every other addictive substance, and it is not always a giant flood. Different drugs act on reward circuits in different ways and with different intensity. But the central point remains. Alcohol can activate the neural systems that help tell the brain something is important, desirable, and worth remembering. That matters because once reward learning begins, the substance is no longer just a thing that changes the moment. It becomes a thing that shapes future desire, and desire is not the same as pleasure. This is a useful distinction because the brain can start wanting something even when the amount of actual pleasure it provides is inconsistent. Dopamine systems are deeply involved in wanting, seeking, and anticipating. A person can therefore find themselves increasingly drawn toward alcohol, not because every drinking experience is wonderful, but because the brain has learned that alcohol is linked to the possibility of relief or reward. This is how habits become sticky. The anticipation itself starts to carry force. By late afternoon, the idea of a drink may already feel soothing before a drop has been consumed. The brain is reacting not only to the present but to the expected future. This also helps explain why alcohol can be especially compelling in unpredictable or stressful lives. Reward systems respond strongly when something provides relief in moments of distress. If drinking sometimes reduces anxiety, loneliness, or emotional noise, that intermittent success can make the pattern more reinforcing, not less. The brain begins to keep alcohol on the list of possible solutions, not because it has carefully evaluated the long-term consequences, but because nervous systems are often more interested in immediate state change than in philosophical consistency. Brains like outcomes they can feel now. Of course, alcohol's early lift is not only dopamine. Other systems contribute as well. Endorphins, which are the body's own opioid-like chemicals, can play a role in the feeling of warmth, comfort, and easing. Serotonin and other modulatory systems may also be influenced, but dopamine is especially helpful for understanding why alcohol does not merely calm the brain. It can make the whole experience feel more inviting. Calm on its own might produce a kind of heavy neutrality. Add reward, and now the state becomes attractive. It begins to glow slightly from within. This combination of calm and reward is one reason early drinking can feel so deceptively manageable. The person is not only less inhibited and less tense, they are also being gently encouraged to see the situation as worthwhile. The internal commentary shifts. The room seems better. The company seems better. One's own stories seem funnier. One's own worries less pressing. One's own presence more acceptable. Whether all of that is objectively true is not especially important to the reward circuits in the moment. Their job is not strict accuracy. Their job is to mark experience as significant and potentially repeatable. There is something almost unfairly clever about this from the standpoint of habit formation. Alcohol does not usually begin by punishing the user. It often begins by rewarding them. The cost arrives later. The sleep disruption arrives later. The memory gaps arrive later. The headache, the rebound anxiety, the clumsy decisions, the interpersonal mess, the slow drift toward tolerance, all of that lives farther down the road. But the reward signal comes early, and early signals teach fast. The brain is more easily persuaded by something that helps now and harms later than by something that harms immediately and explains itself politely afterward. This early lift can also make people feel more authentic, which is another illusion worth noticing. Someone may say they feel more like themselves after a drink. That experience can be real in the emotional sense. The person may genuinely feel less burdened by fear or self-monitoring. But neurologically, the change often comes from reduced inhibition and altered reward processing, not from some hidden truer self finally stepping onto the stage in proper lighting. Alcohol can make expression easier, but easier is not always deeper. It can make emotions more accessible, but accessible is not always more accurate. It can make connection feel smoother, but smoother is not always more genuine. The brain under reward and disinhibition is not lying exactly, but it is not performing under sober conditions either. Another interesting feature of alcohol's reward effects is that they are often strongest early and then change character as drinking continues. The first part of the curve may include mild stimulation, mood lift, sociability, and a sense of momentum. Later, with more alcohol, sedation becomes heavier, coordination worsens, cognition slows further, and the pleasantness may flatten or become less clean. This is one reason some people keep chasing the feeling of the first one or two drinks and rarely quite catch it again in the same evening. The chemistry has shifted. What was once reward mixed with mild calming is becoming impairment mixed with more diffuse sedation. But because the brain remembers the early lift so well, it may continue reaching for the next drink as though the original feeling was still just one glass away. This chasing quality is important. The reward system is not always satisfied by the actual outcome. Sometimes it keeps pushing pursuit based on learned expectation. A person can therefore continue drinking partly under the influence of a remembered promise. The first drink felt warm and good. The next one might perhaps deepen that. Sometimes it does for a while. Sometimes it mostly deepens the impairment instead. But the brain's motivational machinery is not always great at updating itself in real time when hope and habit are involved. Human beings are quite talented at continuing toward a state that is already slipping away. The social setting adds another layer. Alcohol is often consumed in groups, and social reward is among the most powerful rewards humans have. If drinking is linked with laughter, acceptance, flirting, celebration, storytelling, or simply the comfortable sense of belonging somewhere for the evening, then alcohol's pharmacological reward becomes tied to interpersonal reward. The brain does not store these separately in neat little labeled drawers. It stores the overall pattern. Drink plus people plus relief plus laughter plus less tension. That is a strong learning package. It means alcohol does not become rewarding only because of what it does chemically, but because it becomes wrapped in some of the oldest and strongest incentives in human life. Being welcomed, being seen, being included, being able to relax among others. This is why the early appeal of alcohol is not a sign of weakness or foolishness. It is a sign that the brain is doing what brains do. It notices what changes internal state. It remembers what reduces distress. It learns what seems to help with social friction. It builds expectations around repeated outcomes. The difficulty is that the brain is very good at learning the near-term lesson and much less elegant about weighting the long-term bill in the moment of temptation. The first good feeling teaches quickly. The longer story takes time to become visible. Over repeated use, this reward pattern can begin to shift in a subtle but important way. At first, alcohol may be consumed mainly because it feels good. Later, in some people, it is consumed increasingly because not drinking feels worse. The reward becomes less about adding pleasure and more about preventing discomfort. Dopamine is still involved in the wanting and seeking, but the emotional tone of the behavior changes. The first phase of alcohol use may be built around the gentle lift. Later phases, in some cases, are built around avoiding the drop. That transition does not happen to everyone, and it does not happen overnight, but the seeds of it are present in the way reward learning works from the beginning. There is also a cruel little mismatch built into the whole system. The more the brain learns that alcohol predicts reward, the more powerful the cues can become. A familiar bar, a certain hour, the end of work, the start of a weekend meal, the sound of a bottle opening, all can begin nudging the reward system into anticipation. But anticipation itself can create craving or restlessness. In other words, the brain can start feeling the pull before the alcohol is present, which means the substance becomes woven not only into pleasure but into tension and expectation too. One begins not merely to enjoy the drink, but to await it. That awaiting can carry emotional weight. And yet, in the very first moments of the relationship, what alcohol offers often feels simpler than all of this. It feels like a softening and a lift. It feels like an easing of the social body and the private mind. It feels like the room improves, as though the hard edges have taken a brief and courteous step back. That feeling is real as experience, but the brain is achieving it by altering reward, attention, and inhibitory control all at once. The gentle lift is therefore not separate from impairment. It is part of the same unfolding process. The good feeling and the growing distortion begin together. This matters especially because a person who feels better also tends to feel more trusting of the process that produced the feeling. If a drink reduces inner friction, the person is more likely to welcome the next stage rather than question it. They may interpret the change as proof that alcohol suits them, that it helps, that it makes things easier in a useful way. And in the short term it may. But the brain's reward systems are not designed to give balanced life advice. They are designed to reinforce what seems to matter now. Immediate relief can therefore be stamped with great enthusiasm even when it leads into poorer decisions later. So when alcohol feels good at first, it is not an accident, and it is not merely a social story people tell themselves to excuse a habit. There is real neurochemistry beneath it. Dopamine and related reward systems help make the experience salient, attractive, and memorable. Alcohol reduces tension and simultaneously marks that reduction as worth repeating. The brain notices the shift, stores the pattern, and becomes more likely to seek it again. That is why the first phase can feel so mild and so convincing. It does not only dim discomfort, it adds just enough reward to make the dimming feel like a gain. But this lift has consequences for behavior, because the same chemistry that makes alcohol feel pleasant early also begins altering how people judge themselves, interpret situations, and restrain impulses. Reward plus reduced inhibition is a powerful combination. It can turn ordinary thoughts into spoken thoughts, tentative feelings into actions, and small risks into choices that seem harmless in the moment. That is where alcohol starts changing not just the mood of the brain, but the behavior of the person living inside it. And that is the next place the story naturally begins to lean. One of the stranger things alcohol does to the brain is that it can make a person feel more free at almost the exact moment they are becoming less accurate. That is a difficult combination, because from the inside it often feels pleasant, even helpful. The mind seems less crowded. The social air seems easier to breathe. Words come faster. Hesitation softens. Self-consciousness loosens its tie and stops hovering so close to the throat. And because all of that can feel like improvement, people often miss what is changing underneath. Alcohol does not simply make the brain more relaxed. It begins altering judgment, trimming back inhibition, and changing the way a person evaluates their own behavior while they are still in the middle of behaving. That is where the edges start to blur. Not all at once, and not always in some dramatic cinematic way. Usually it is more ordinary than that. A slightly louder laugh, a quicker interruption, a story told with less concern for whether everyone already heard it at a wedding 2 summers ago, a message sent with more confidence than wisdom, a joke judged excellent by the speaker and less so by the room. These changes often arrive in small steps, which is one reason they are easy to excuse. They seem like variations in mood or sociability, rather than the early signs of a brain losing some of its usual precision. But that precision matters. It is the quiet machinery behind restraint, timing, social sensitivity, consequence weighing, and the ability to say to oneself, perhaps not. A great deal of that machinery depends on the prefrontal cortex, the region near the front of the brain that helps with planning, impulse control, decision-making, attention regulation, and social judgment. This area does not work alone, of course. No brain region is a tiny executive in a private office, running everything while the rest merely files paperwork. But the prefrontal cortex is deeply involved in helping human beings do one of their most difficult and useful things, which is pause. Pause before speaking. Pause before acting. Pause before trusting the feeling of the moment more than the consequences of the next hour. It helps turn raw impulse into something more deliberate. When alcohol begins disrupting the system, the person may feel more spontaneous, but what is often being lost is not repression in some noble enemy sense. What is being lost is control. That loss does not always look unpleasant at first. In fact, some of its earliest versions can seem socially advantageous. Someone who is shy may become more talkative. Someone who is usually stiff may become easier in their body. Someone who spends too much of ordinary life editing every sentence may feel relief in speaking without so much internal review. And because social inhibition can be genuinely exhausting, the reduction of it can feel like a kindness. But the brain does not have a special setting where it reduces only the unnecessary restraints, while carefully protecting the wise ones. Once inhibition is weakened, it is weakened broadly. The same change that makes a person more willing to say hello can also make them more willing to say the second thing, the third thing, and eventually the thing that would have been better left uninvited. This is partly because judgment is not a separate little box tucked safely away from mood and impulse. It is integrated into the same ongoing neural conversation. When alcohol reduces the brain's ability to regulate itself carefully, it does not simply create more emotion or more expression. It changes how emotion is interpreted, how expression is timed, how risk is weighed, and how much importance is given to immediate feeling versus later consequence. The sober brain is constantly making small corrections. That comment may land badly. That person seems uncomfortable. This idea is funny in my head but may not survive travel into the air. That road home is longer than it looks. That second drink is not the same choice as it was an hour ago. These corrections happen so often and so quietly that people rarely notice the amount of work they represent. Alcohol weakens that work. This is why confidence under alcohol can be such a poor guide. A person may feel more certain while becoming less right. The sense of I'm fine can remain intact long after fine has started slipping out the side door. This is not because people become foolish in some moral sense. It is because the parts of the brain that would normally detect subtle losses of control are themselves being affected. If the instrument panel is failing, the pilot may continue feeling oddly assured. Alcohol does not merely impair performance, it can impair the ability to notice impairment, which is a deeply inconvenient feature for a substance often taken in situations where people make decisions. That changing relationship to judgment is one reason people under alcohol often become more impulsive. Impulsivity is not simply doing wild things in a nightclub while a stranger in silver shoes cheers from across the room. Much of it is more ordinary than that. It is choosing what feels good now over what makes sense later, sending the message, starting the argument, making the purchase, telling the secret, accepting the dare, taking the risk on the road. ordering another drink because the current brain state approves of repeating the behavior that created it. Impulsivity is often a reduction in delay. The pause becomes shorter. The bridge between urge and action becomes less guarded. Alcohol shortens that bridge. This matters especially in social settings because human interaction depends on finely timed restraint. Conversation is not merely words. It is pacing, tone, reading faces, noticing tension, adjusting to context, holding back when necessary, and understanding that the thought in one's head is not automatically a gift to the group. The sober brain does a great deal of filtering to help social life remain tolerable. Alcohol weakens that filter. As a result, people may become more disinhibited, more interruptive, more repetitive, more emotionally reactive or less sensitive to cues that others are bored, uneasy, amused, offended, or ready to go home and lie very still in a dark room. This is where the idea of a changing personality often enters. People say alcohol makes someone become someone else. Sometimes that certainly seems true from the outside. A kind person becomes sharp. A reserved person becomes sentimental. A calm person becomes argumentative. A shy person becomes theatrical. A self-controlled person becomes reckless. But it is worth being careful with that language. Alcohol does not typically insert a brand new personality into the skull like a surprise guest. More often, it changes which parts of the existing person are being regulated, amplified, or restrained. Traits and impulses that are usually managed may become more visible. Emotional reactions that are usually softened may emerge more quickly. Prior frustrations may gain less supervision. That does not mean alcohol reveals some pure hidden essence. Though people are very fond of saying things like, "That's who they really are when they drink." The truth is usually less tidy. Alcohol creates a state in which the brain regulates behavior differently. What comes out in that state is real behavior, certainly, but it is not necessarily a more truthful version of the self. It is a less regulated one. This distinction matters because people often romanticize disinhibition. They treat drunkenness as honesty with a loosened collar, as though alcohol strips away pretense and leaves only truth. Sometimes people do say things under alcohol that they have been afraid to say sober, but they also say things that are exaggerated, distorted, poorly timed, misread, overconfident, needlessly cruel, or wildly sentimental in ways that would not survive daylight and hydration. Alcohol can reduce fear, yes. It can also reduce perspective. It can make emotion feel urgent and correct simply because the systems that would normally evaluate that emotion are less effective. A person under alcohol may feel they are finally speaking from the heart, when in fact they are speaking from a heart that has been handed a microphone and no editor. Another feature of weakened inhibition is emotional spillover. Sober life involves continual modulation. People feel irritation but do not always express it. They feel sadness but do not always collapse into it. They feel attraction but do not always act. They feel competitiveness but do not always turn dinner into a referendum on their worth as a human being. The ability to modulate does not make emotion fake. It makes social living possible. Alcohol weakens that modulation. The result can be laughter that grows too large, tears that arrive without much warning, anger that escalates too fast, affection that becomes embarrassingly expansive, or confidence that swells into a version of courage best described as poorly supervised. The mood of the person can shift more quickly because the internal systems that help stabilize and channel emotion are doing a weaker job. This is one reason alcohol can seem unpredictable. Two people may drink similar amounts and behave very differently. One becomes warm and affectionate, another becomes hostile, another becomes quiet and inward, another becomes restless and impulsive. Part of this is individual personality, part is life history, part is setting, and part is which circuits are being affected most strongly in that person under those conditions. Alcohol interacts with the brain, a bit like weather moving through a landscape. The chemistry is the storm system, but the terrain matters. Existing emotional patterns, unresolved tensions, learned coping styles, sleep deprivation, stress, social context, all of these shape what kind of behavioural weather shows up. Expectation also matters here, because people are not passive objects waiting to be chemically rearranged without opinion. Many enter drinking situations with ideas about what alcohol means for them. One person expects to become lively, another expects to become calm, another expects permission to flirt, confess, or complain more than usual. These expectations can influence behaviour alongside the direct pharmacological effects. The brain is not just being changed by alcohol, it is also acting out learned scripts associated with alcohol. If someone has repeatedly experienced drinking as a time when emotional intensity is acceptable, or when conflict is more likely, or when saying reckless things is somehow part of the evening's theme, those patterns can become more available once alcohol reduces inhibition. Judgment suffers in more concrete ways too. Risk assessment becomes less reliable. People often underestimate danger when drinking, especially social or immediate danger. The brain becomes more focused on the present emotional frame and less effective at simulating outcomes accurately. That is one reason alcohol is linked to so many choices that seem baffling afterward. The sober mind asks, why on earth did I think that was sensible? The answer is often that the intoxicated mind was not running the same calculation. Immediate reward, emotional urgency, peer presence, and reduced prefrontal oversight created a very different internal mathematics. The person did not merely choose badly with full sober clarity. They chose under altered neural conditions that favoured short-term impulse over long-term consequence. Driving is one of the clearest and most serious examples. Safe driving depends on a remarkably demanding mix of attention, reaction time, divided focus, visual tracking, prediction, inhibition, and good judgment. Alcohol interferes with all of these, and it can do so before a person feels especially intoxicated. The overconfidence problem is critical here, because early alcohol can create a sense of calm and competence, while already slowing response and weakening judgment. People may sincerely but dangerously believe they are capable of driving. This is not evidence that alcohol helps them drive relaxed. It is evidence that the brain's self-assessment systems have joined the general decline. A relaxed bad decision is still a bad decision, only with a soundtrack and perhaps more cheerful last words. Alcohol also changes attention in a way that contributes to poor judgment. Under its influence, people can become more narrowly focused on the most immediate and emotionally obvious features of a situation while giving less weight to background information or future consequence. Psychologists sometimes describe this with the idea of alcohol myopia. The term is useful because it suggests short-sightedness, not in the optical sense of needing glasses for restaurant menus, but in the cognitive sense. The intoxicated brain pays more attention to what is directly in front of it, and less to the wider picture. If the immediate cue is fun, the risk can fade from view. If the immediate cue is insult, the bigger context can disappear. If the immediate cue is desire, caution weakens. A brain narrowed toward the present becomes easier to steer by momentary feeling. This narrowing can make social misunderstandings more likely. Someone may misread flirtation, hostility, boredom, or consent, because the full context is no longer being integrated well. Alcohol can therefore increase both the confidence with which a person interprets social cues and the likelihood that those interpretations are wrong. That is a difficult pairing. Strong certainty plus weaker perception is not a formula that has historically improved many evenings, yet it is common. The person feels bold enough to act and less careful in evaluating whether the action fits reality. There is also a timing aspect to the changing personality effect. The first portion of drinking may make someone appear brighter, warmer, or more expressive. Later, as impairment deepens, that can shift into repetition, poor coordination, sluggish thought, irritability, or emotional instability. Friends often notice this slope before the person living it does. The evening may seem to contain multiple versions of the same person: early sociable, later sloppy, early witty, later insistent, early open-hearted, later tearful or combative. This progression is not evidence of multiple secret selves. It is evidence of a changing brain state over time as alcohol concentration rises and the systems responsible for inhibition, judgment, emotional regulation, and motor control continue to be affected. Memory also begins to matter here, even before obvious blackouts. When judgment is changing, the brain is already becoming less effective at encoding experience cleanly. That means the person may later reconstruct their behaviour partly from fragments, emotional impressions, or what others tell them. This can create the strange and unsettling experience of hearing about oneself as though one were a mildly troublesome acquaintance. You were very emotional. You kept repeating that point. You got angry about the music. You insisted you were perfectly balanced while hugging a doorway for support. Because memory formation is becoming less reliable, the changing personality under alcohol can later feel oddly unreal to the person who displayed it. But the unreality comes from poor encoding, not from the behaviour having not occurred. A particularly difficult social consequence of alcohol's effect on inhibition is that it can reduce empathy in practical moments. Not necessarily deep moral empathy in some grand lifelong sense, but the real-time ability to inhibit one's own impulse long enough to fully register another person's state. If someone is uncomfortable, setting a boundary, needing space, or reacting with subtle unease, the intoxicated brain may be slower or less willing to integrate that information. This is part of why drinking can contribute to arguments, coercive behaviour, boundary violations, and situations later described as "I honestly didn't realise." Sometimes that lack of realisation is sincere, but sincerity does not undo the fact that alcohol made realisation less likely in the first place. At the same time, some people become more affectionate and seemingly generous under alcohol. Again, this can look like personality transformation. The stern friend becomes tender. The emotionally guarded sibling suddenly sends long messages about appreciation and destiny and the beauty of pasta. These moments can feel touching, and sometimes they are. But even here, inhibition is central. The person may be expressing feelings they usually keep hidden, or they may be exaggerating emotions because the normal systems of proportion are weaker. Alcohol can make sentiments feel larger, more urgent, more complete than they would under sober review. This is why drunken declarations can range from moving to absurd, sometimes within the same minute. One might ask whether all inhibition is good, then if removing it creates so much trouble. Not exactly. Inhibition is not virtue by itself. Too much fear, too much self-silencing, too much rigid control can make life small and exhausting. That is part of why alcohol's softening effect can feel so appealing. It can briefly relieve the burdens of excessive inhibition, but the brain does not remove only the excess. It loosens the whole structure. What people often need in life is not chemically weakened control, but better and more flexible control, the kind that lets them relax when relaxation is safe and remain wise when wisdom is needed. Alcohol provides the first part cheaply and takes the second part with it. Repeated drinking can also make these personality shifts more patterned. Over time, certain emotional or behavioural modes can become associated with alcohol so strongly that they appear almost reliably. The brain learns not only that alcohol changes state, but which state tends to follow. Someone may become predictably sentimental after 2 drinks, predictably irritable after 4, predictably reckless in a particular environment, predictably quiet and withdrawn once the early lift passes. These patterns can become part of a person's social identity, the sort of thing friends half joke about and quietly prepare for. But beneath the pattern is still the same principle. Alcohol is repeatedly changing how the brain regulates judgment and inhibition, and repeated changes can carve familiar grooves. The saddest part of this, perhaps, is that people often come to rely on alcohol not only for pleasure, but for permission. Permission to speak, permission to flirt, permission to grieve, permission to dance badly and not care, permission to say "I love you" without having to stand there sober afterward, feeling far too visible. The substance becomes not merely a drink but a passport into versions of the self that seem unavailable otherwise. That reliance can deepen because the brain remembers both the reward and the reduced inhibition. But when permission depends on impairment, the person never quite gets to practice being freer with full clarity. The skill remains outsourced to chemistry. And this brings us back to the changing personality question. Alcohol does not produce a clean alternate self. It changes the balance of control, reward, emotion, attention, and social interpretation in ways that let different behaviors emerge. Some of those behaviors may reflect real feelings, some may reflect distorted emphasis, some may reveal patterns a sober person usually keeps in check for very good reasons. The result can look like transformation because the usual guards are down, the timing's off, the inner editor is sleepy, and the person feels more certain than they should. The edges blur between bravery and impulsivity, honesty and oversharing, warmth and intrusion, confidence and carelessness. All of this is happening while another essential function of the brain is quietly becoming less reliable, the ability to turn present experience into stable memory. A person may be speaking more freely and acting more boldly at the very same time the machinery for recording those moments is beginning to fail. That combination gives alcohol some of its most unsettling power. It can lower inhibition while weakening memory, allowing people to move through an evening with fewer breaks and fewer records. And once that process deepens, the story shifts from changing personality to missing time, because the brain that is growing less careful about behavior is also becoming less capable of keeping what happened. There is a particular kind of unease that belongs to alcohol and memory. It is not always dramatic at first. Sometimes it begins as a small uncertainty the next day, a missing detail, a conversation that feels slightly out of reach, a joke everyone else remembers better than you do. You know the evening happened. You were there. You were speaking, walking, reacting, laughing, perhaps insisting with great confidence that you were absolutely fine, and yet parts of it begin to feel strangely thin, as though the night was written on paper left out in the rain. That feeling is more than a social embarrassment or a rough morning puzzle. It points to one of the most important things alcohol does in the brain. It interferes with the process by which experience becomes memory. This is one of the reasons alcohol can be so deceptive. Many of its early effects happen while consciousness is still clearly present. A person is awake. They may be talking normally enough. They may be interacting, making decisions, ordering another drink, sending messages, holding a conversation that seems perfectly meaningful in the moment. From the outside, and often from the inside as well, it can seem as though the mind is still there in full. But memory is not the same thing as being awake, and it is not the same thing as appearing functional for a stretch of time. The brain does not merely need consciousness to remember. It needs very specific systems to encode experience, stabilize it, and store it. Alcohol begins disrupting those systems well before a person necessarily passes out or collapses into obvious confusion. To understand why, it helps to remember that memory is not a single container in the mind where events are dropped like receipts into a drawer. It is a process, several processes really. First, the brain has to attend to what is happening. Then it has to encode that information, which means turning the experience into a form the nervous system can keep. Then it has to consolidate it, stabilizing the memory over time so it does not simply evaporate. Finally, later on, the brain has to retrieve it. We often talk about memory as though it is one solid thing, but losing a memory can happen because it was never stored properly in the first place, because it was stored weakly, because later consolidation was disrupted, or because retrieval fails even though some trace remains. Alcohol has its hands on several parts of this process, but one of the most important points of interference is right near the beginning. It makes it harder for the brain to form new memories while events are unfolding. A central player here is the hippocampus, a structure buried deep in the brain that is essential for forming many kinds of new declarative memories. The sort of memories that let you later say what happened, who was there, what was said, what you did, what you agreed to, where you put something, or why you suddenly found yourself eating cold chips in a kitchen you do not entirely remember entering. The hippocampus is not a storage closet that keeps every memory forever, but it is vital in helping the brain turn current experience into something that can later be recalled. And this is where alcohol causes trouble. As we wandered through earlier, alcohol reduces the activity of certain glutamate receptors, especially NMDA receptors, which are very important for synaptic plasticity, the brain's ability to strengthen or weaken connections as learning happens. That plasticity is crucial for memory formation. If you interfere with it, the brain becomes worse at making new records of ongoing experience. This means that alcohol can create a very strange condition. A person may remain conscious and active while their ability to lay down stable memory is increasingly weakened. They are participating in the evening but not reliably keeping it. That is what makes alcohol-related memory loss so unsettling compared with ordinary forgetting. It is not just that the person later fails to retrieve something that was stored. In many cases, the memory was never properly recorded to begin with. The event did not make it cleanly into long-term storage. It is as though the brain's note-taking hand was present but shaky, and eventually set the pen down altogether while the rest of the person kept talking. This can begin in mild ways. People often call it being foggy about night out, and sometimes that fog is simply the normal result of poor sleep, divided attention, emotional overload, or not especially caring about every detail of a routine evening. But alcohol can produce something more specific. Fragments remain, but the sequence is broken. One remembers arriving somewhere, then remembers a conversation much later, then remembers standing outside, then nothing for a stretch, then a vivid image of trying to explain something passionately to a lamppost, or perhaps a cousin. This patchwork quality happens because memory encoding under alcohol can become inconsistent. Some moments are stored, others are weakly stored, others disappear from the record altogether. It is important to say that this is not the same as losing consciousness. A person can have significant memory gaps without ever passing out. They may have walked, spoken, ordered food, answered questions, laughed, argued, cried, danced, or repeated the same story 3 times with the proud conviction of a great oral historian. The body was functioning, the social self appeared active, yet the memory system was failing to keep up. This is one of alcohol's most unsettling talents. It can allow behaviour to continue while cutting holes in the record of that behaviour. A person can therefore be fully accountable for actions they do not later remember, which makes the social and emotional aftermath particularly painful. People often use the word blackout for this phenomenon, though blackouts come in more than one form. Sometimes there is a fragmentary blackout, where pieces of memory can be recovered with cues. A friend mentions the taxi ride and suddenly part of it returns. Someone reminds you of a conversation and a few details flicker back to life. Other times there is an en-bloc blackout, where a whole stretch of time simply never made it into memory at all. No amount of prompting brings it back because there is nothing stable there to retrieve. This difference matters because it shows that alcohol's effects on memory are not always all or nothing. The brain's recording system can degrade in stages before it fails more completely. What makes this especially tricky is that memory disruption does not necessarily arrive with outward signs that look dramatic enough to warn everyone around. A person can seem coherent, can respond to questions, can move through familiar routines, and still be forming memories very poorly. Alcohol impairs the hippocampus more readily than casual observers appreciate. The brain's ability to create a record may be collapsing while speech still sounds mostly ordinary to people who are not paying close attention, especially if they themselves are drinking. This is one reason group drinking can produce such collective confusion the next day. Several brains may have been impaired at once, and the evening becomes a collaboration between people who all thought reality was being filed properly at the time. The speed of drinking matters a great deal here. Blackouts and major memory gaps are more strongly associated not only with how much alcohol is consumed, but with how quickly blood alcohol concentration rises. A fast climb can overwhelm the brain's ability to adapt in the moment. Several drinks in a short window, drinking on an empty stomach, shots, intense pre-drinking before going out. All of these patterns can push the memory system into danger more quickly than a person expects. Again, the body clears alcohol more slowly than people often consume it. So a person may still be in the early mood lift stage while the concentration is rising toward a level that the hippocampus will not appreciate in the slightest. This is why memory problems under alcohol often surprise people. They may think of blackout drinking as something that happens only in the most visibly extreme situations, but from the brain's point of view, what matters is not social dignity but concentration and rate of change. Someone does not have to look like a ruined cartoon of intoxication to be recording events badly. A person can still be upright, still speaking, still functioning in narrow ways, while the machinery that would normally preserve those moments is being sharply compromised. There is another reason alcohol-related memory loss feels so unnerving. Memory is tied deeply to identity. We understand ourselves not only through what we feel now, but through continuity, through the ongoing sense that the person who woke up this morning is connected to the person who moved through yesterday and last night. Memory gives shape to that continuity. It lets us say, this happened to me, I chose that, I regret that, I loved that, I learned from that, I was there. When alcohol cuts out sections of experience, even temporarily, it does more than create inconvenience. It breaks continuity. It leaves the person facing testimony about themselves instead of memory. Other people become the historians of one's own actions. That is a deeply vulnerable feeling. Sometimes the response is shame, sometimes fear, sometimes disbelief. People may say, I would never do that, or I do not remember saying that, or that does not sound like me. Sometimes they are resisting responsibility. Sometimes they are genuinely stunned, because their internal record simply does not contain the event. The brain that usually provides the sense of authorship and continuity has gaps in the file, and unlike many forms of forgetting, this does not feel like a gentle fading. It feels like time was lived without being kept. Alcohol also interferes with working memory and attention in the moment, which compounds the problem. Working memory is the system that helps you hold and manipulate information over short periods, such as keeping track of what someone just said, following a thread of conversation, remembering why you walked into the kitchen, or staying with a plan long enough to finish it. When working memory weakens, the present itself becomes harder to hold in an organized way. The person is more distractible, more easily derailed, less coherent in sequence. And because good encoding often depends on good attention, what fails in the present is less likely to be remembered later. The brain is not only writing with a shakier hand, it is also paying less careful attention to the material. Emotion complicates this further. Under ordinary circumstances, emotional experiences are often remembered more strongly than neutral ones. Fear, embarrassment, joy, conflict, novelty, all can stamp events more vividly into memory. But under alcohol, even emotional intensity does not guarantee good encoding. A person may feel something enormously in the moment and still have only a broken or distorted record of it later. That can create bizarre after effects. One may wake with a powerful emotional residue, shame, sorrow, affection, anxiety, anger, without a clear narrative attached. The body remembers the storm while the story itself is missing pages. That is an especially difficult state because feelings without context can become magnified and confusing. Sleep then enters the scene, and often makes matters worse. Real memory consolidation depends heavily on sleep, especially well-structured sleep cycling. Alcohol tends to disrupt that structure. It may help a person fall asleep more quickly at first, but the quality of the sleep that follows is often poorer. Sleep becomes more fragmented. REM sleep can be suppressed or shifted. Later in the night, arousal increases. The result is that even memories that were weakly encoded may receive less effective consolidation. So alcohol harms memory both while the event is happening and afterward, during the period when the brain would ideally be organising and stabilising what was learned. It is a rather thorough sabotage for something sold in such festive packaging. This is part of why sleeping it off is not the tidy solution people imagine. Yes, time will allow the body to metabolise the alcohol, but the night's sleep may not restore the brain as cleanly as hoped. The person may wake not only dehydrated or tired, but cognitively patchy. Some of what is missing may never return. Some may return only in fragments triggered by cues. Some may return with distortion, as the brain tries to build a coherent story from incomplete materials. Human memory is already reconstructive even when sober. Under alcohol, the materials for reconstruction become poorer, and the confidence with which people fill in the gaps can be surprisingly high. That means the next day narrative may include guesses dressed as memories, especially if friends tell overlapping stories and everyone involved is slightly hungover and not performing at peak archival standards. There is also the question of repeated exposure. If alcohol is used often enough, especially in heavier patterns, the memory problem can become more than episodic. Chronic heavy drinking can affect the brain in broader ways, contributing over time to difficulties with learning, recall, attention, and executive function. Severe long-term alcohol misuse can damage memory systems profoundly, especially when paired with nutritional deficiency, most famously a deficiency in thiamine, which can contribute to serious neurological syndromes involving confusion and amnesia. But even before anything that's severe develops, the repeated pairing of drinking with memory failure creates a pattern. The brain becomes accustomed to evenings that are only partially preserved. This can normalize something that should feel alarming. A person starts treating missing memory as an expected inconvenience rather than evidence that the brain's recording equipment is being regularly interfered with. One of the more deceptive aspects of fragmentary memory is that people sometimes take it as proof they were not that impaired. I remember most of the night, they say, so I must have been all right. But memory is not a perfect measure of function. A person can remember stretches of a night and still have been significantly impaired. Likewise, a person may have no memory of a stretch and yet appeared outwardly functional to others. The relationship between memory and visible behaviour under alcohol is not linear enough to reassure anyone. What it tells us more reliably is that the brain systems necessary for keeping track of lived experience are vulnerable, and alcohol targets them early. There is also a certain cruelty in the emotional dynamics this creates. Alcohol often lowers inhibition and increases impulsivity at the same time it disrupts memory. That means people may act with fewer breaks and fewer records. They may say what they would not say, do what they would not do, agree to what they would not normally agree to, start fights, seek comfort, confess feelings, reveal secrets, make promises, cross boundaries, all while creating an incomplete personal archive of those choices. That combination gives alcohol some of its darkest social power. A person may later be left with consequences they cannot fully remember making, and others may be left dealing with behaviour the drinker genuinely cannot reconstruct. This is one reason conversations about alcohol and consent, conflict and accountability are so serious. Memory impairment does not erase action. The fact that a person does not remember is not the same as the event not occurring. And because alcohol can impair both memory and judgment, dangerous situations can unfold with the people involved having very different records and very different capacities in the moment. The social implications of this are profound. The brain's inability to keep the event does not protect anyone from the event itself. At a milder level, even ordinary memory slips under alcohol have effects on relationships. Repeatedly forgetting conversations, promises, emotional exchanges, or practical details can erode trust. The partner remembers the conversation. The friend remembers being ignored, or comforted, or insulted, or told a secret, or asked a question that had already been answered twice. The drinker remembers only a hazy atmosphere and perhaps a suspicious confidence that things probably went fine. Over time, this mismatch can produce resentment. Alcohol turns the burden of memory over to the people around the drinker, and that is not always a light burden. What is especially unfortunate is that the early emotional appeal of alcohol can make this danger easy to overlook. The first part of the evening feels warm, manageable, easier than sober life sometimes does. The loss of sharpness seems almost kind. The reward systems approve. The social atmosphere softens. Yet all the while, the hippocampus is becoming less effective at the very task that would later allow the person to own the evening fully. The brain is trading presence for partial absence. It feels present in the moment while becoming absent in the record. There is also a biological irony here. The human brain evolved to care deeply about memory because memory helps survival. Learn where food is, learn who is safe, learn what hurt you, learn what to avoid, learn what matters. The ability to keep experience is one of the reasons people can build lives rather than merely react hour by hour. Alcohol interrupts that ancient function in exchange for a temporary state shift. It does not merely make the current moment feel different. It can prevent the current moment from becoming a usable part of the future. That is a steep bargain, even when it is made casually. And yet, because the memory loss is often patchy, people can talk themselves into minimizing it. They recall enough to build a comforting storyline. They remember the toast, the laugh, the taxi, maybe the song, and conclude the rest was probably unimportant or uneventful. Sometimes that is true, sometimes not. The problem is that the brain under alcohol is not a reliable witness about what was worth keeping. Important moments can be lost alongside trivial ones. Tenderness, conflict, consent, risk, injury, all can disappear into the same gap. The memory system does not politely preserve only the meaningful bits while discarding the embarrassing dance moves. So when alcohol leaves memory in fragments, it is not performing a quirky party trick. It is disrupting the machinery by which the brain tries to turn life into something coherent and retrievable. The hippocampus struggles. Glutamate signaling is altered. Attention weakens. Working memory slips. Sleep later fails to consolidate what was poorly encoded. The result is a person who may have been present in body and active in behavior, yet later finds themselves standing at the edge of missing time. And missing time changes how people feel about themselves. It can leave shame, fear, dependence on other people's accounts, and the strange sensation that part of one's own life happened without permission from memory. What makes this even more difficult is that memory loss under alcohol does not arrive alone. The same chemical changes that interfere with the brain's ability to keep the night also interfere with movement, balance, speech, and physical coordination. The brain that is losing the record is often also losing the fine control of the body. That is where the story begins to shift from what the mind can keep to what the body can no longer do with its usual precision, and once that starts happening, alcohol becomes visible not only in missing memories, but in the movements and signals of the person moving through the room. At some point in the story of alcohol, the changes stop being only inward. What began as a feeling, a softening of thought, a loosening of inhibition, a warm shift in mood, starts becoming visible in the body. That is often the stage people think of first when they imagine intoxication, because it is easier to see than altered memory or subtle failures of judgment. A step goes slightly crooked. A sentence takes longer to leave the mouth. A hand reaches for a glass with less precision than usual. Someone laughs too loudly, and then needs a moment to steady themselves against a table they are pretending they touched on purpose. The body begins to tell the truth that the mind has been flattering. Alcohol is no longer only changing how the person feels, it is changing how well the nervous system can coordinate movement, speech, posture, timing, and control. This happens because movement is never as simple as it looks. Human beings are very impressive at making extraordinary coordination appear ordinary. Walking across a room feels trivial because the brain does the work quietly. Standing upright, turning the head, maintaining balance, tracking where the limbs are, adjusting the force of a step, stabilizing vision while moving, shaping words with the tongue and lips. All of this depends on a constant and very delicate conversation between different brain regions and the body itself. The cerebellum helps coordinate timing and precision. The motor cortex helps plan and initiate movement. The basal ganglia help regulate the smooth execution of actions. The vestibular system in the inner ear helps with balance and spatial orientation. Sensory systems provide feedback about touch, pressure, limb position, and movement through space. The brainstem supports posture, arousal, and vital functions. Even a simple act like standing up and walking toward the door is a small symphony of correction and anticipation. Alcohol does not need to shut that symphony down completely to make it sound noticeably worse. A few mistuned sections are enough. The cerebellum is especially important here. It sits toward the back of the brain and is crucial for the fine-tuning of movement. It helps make actions smooth rather than jerky, accurate rather than sloppy, proportionate rather than excessive. If you reach for a cup without knocking it over, if you walk downstairs without needing to negotiate individually with each step, if you touch your nose with your finger while your eyes are closed and do not accidentally poke a cheek, you are relying in part on cerebellar coordination. Alcohol affects this system quite readily. As blood alcohol concentration rises, the cerebellum becomes less effective at integrating sensory input and correcting movement in real time. Timing slips, force becomes less precise, balance begins to wander. The body becomes less good at the small ongoing adjustments that sober life usually hides from view. This is one reason drunken movement often looks exaggerated or delayed. The person is still trying to do the same actions, but the fine control is fading. A turn is wider than necessary, a reach is slightly off, a step lands with more uncertainty. The person may compensate by moving more slowly or by adopting the curious and rather unconvincing strategy of standing perfectly still for a moment, as if that will erase what everyone just watched happen. But the nervous system is already working under altered conditions. It is not only that muscles are weaker. Muscles are often quite capable. The problem is that the brain's instructions are less precise and the body's corrections are slower or less accurate. Balance, in particular, is a wonderfully demanding task that people do not appreciate until it starts going wrong. To remain upright, the brain must constantly combine information from the eyes, the inner ears, the muscles, the joints, and the skin. It must know where the body is in relation to gravity, how fast it is moving, where the weight is shifting, whether the ground is stable, and how to adjust posture accordingly. Alcohol interferes with several parts of this process at once. It affects cerebellar control, it alters vestibular function, and it slows the integration of sensory information. The result is that the person can feel less stable even before they fully admit it to themselves. Turning too quickly becomes a risk. Standing up from a chair suddenly feels more ambitious than expected. Stairs begin to resemble a moral test. The inner ear contributes to some of the peculiar dizziness people feel with alcohol. The vestibular system detects head movement and position, helping the brain maintain equilibrium. Alcohol can disturb the fluid dynamics and neural processing related to this system, especially when levels are high or changing. This contributes to vertigo, spinning sensations, and the unpleasant instability that can appear when someone lies down and discovers that the ceiling has acquired unfortunate enthusiasm. The room is not moving, of course, but the systems that normally keep motion and orientation aligned are not functioning cleanly. The brain is receiving confused information about position and movement, and the body reacts accordingly. Speech is another area where alcohol's effects become visible, and again the mechanism is more complex than simple tiredness. Speaking requires remarkable coordination. The brain must select words, sequence them, retrieve sounds, control breathing, time the movement of the vocal cords, tongue, lips, jaw, and facial muscles, and monitor what is being said while it is being said. Under sober conditions, this generally happens quickly enough that people forget how much machinery it requires. Under alcohol, the machinery becomes less coordinated. Speech may slow, words may blur together, consonants may lose their edges, syllables may arrive out of order or with suspicious enthusiasm. The voice itself may grow louder or less carefully modulated because self-monitoring is weaker. A person can therefore sound more emotional, more confident, more repetitive, and less precise all at once. This change in speech is not just socially noticeable. It reflects deeper motor and cognitive changes happening together. Slurred speech often suggests that the fine motor control of the mouth and face is being disrupted, but it also points to slowing in the broader systems that support language production and attention. The person may take longer to organize a sentence, may lose the thread partway through, may repeat themselves, or may feel that what they are saying is perfectly clear, while everyone else realizes the message is now traveling through syrup. Once again, alcohol shows its unfortunate habit of impairing not only function, but awareness of impaired function. The speaker often believes they sound more coherent than they do. Reaction time also suffers early, and this matters because the body depends on fast adjustments all the time. Catching a stumble, correcting a misstep, noticing an obstacle, braking at a traffic light, moving a hand away from a hot surface, responding to another person's movement in a crowd, all of this depends on rapid perception and response. Alcohol slows these processes. Signals still move, but not with the same speed or precision. The person may therefore seem only slightly clumsy in obvious ways while being significantly less capable of responding to sudden changes in their environment. This is part of why alcohol increases the risk of falls, collisions, driving accidents, and all the smaller injuries that begin with the sentence, "I was fine until I wasn't." Hands reveal a great deal in this phase. A person may still feel socially composed while their fingers are betraying them. They may fumble with a phone, misjudge the force needed to pick something up, spill while pouring, or have trouble doing tasks that require sequence and precision. Buttons become less cooperative. Keys develop a mysterious aversion to locks. Writing becomes less neat. Even gestures can become slightly off, either larger than intended or less accurately aimed. These are not moral failings on the part of the hands. They are signs that the systems coordinating movement are losing finesse. Vision contributes its own distortions. Alcohol can impair eye movements and the ability to track smoothly, especially when trying to follow moving objects or shift gaze rapidly between points. It can also affect contrast sensitivity and visual processing more broadly. The person may not notice these changes clearly, because vision often feels normal enough in the center of attention, but the integration between vision and movement is becoming less reliable. This is one reason driving is so dangerous under alcohol. Safe driving depends not only on steering, but on constantly interpreting visual information, predicting motion, dividing attention, and making split-second corrections. A person may believe they can see well enough while already being slower and less accurate in how they use what they see. It is tempting to think of this stage as a simple slide from graceful to ungraceful, but it is more specific than that. Alcohol does not make movement bad in some vague overall sense. It reduces the nervous system's ability to keep movement finely calibrated. Calibration is the key word. Sober movement is full of tiny corrections. Too far to the left, adjust. Too much force, reduce. Too quick, slow. Heel slipping, compensate. Word not clear, reshape it. Alcohol weakens calibration. The body can still act, but it acts with poorer correction, slower timing, and less nuanced control. That is why intoxicated motion can look both overdone and uncertain. The body is still trying to perform ordinary life with a less exacting conductor. The face changes too. People often think of intoxication as something one can hide so long as one keeps conversation lively and remains committed to standing near furniture. But facial muscles and eye control are part of the same system of fine regulation. Eyelids may droop, expressions may lag or become exaggerated, eye contact may become less steady, either too intense or too difficult to maintain. The face may look less organised somehow, not because the person has become mysterious, but because motor control and self-monitoring are both weaker. Much of human communication depends on subtle facial timing, and alcohol makes subtle timing more difficult. There is also the question of why some people seem more outwardly impaired than others. Part of this is simple variation in tolerance, body size, drinking pace, fatigue, and genetics. Part is practice, though that should not be mistaken for safety. A person who is drunk often may learn to mask some visible signs of intoxication better than someone who drinks rarely. They may move more carefully, speak more deliberately, or appear composed for longer. But that does not mean the underlying impairment is absent. It may simply be distributed differently or hidden beneath compensation. The brain is still being affected. The body is still losing fine control in ways that matter. Sometimes the most dangerous drinker is not the one who looks obviously drunk, but the one who looks just controlled enough to believe they can keep going. The environment matters here as well. A quiet living room with soft chairs and a clear floor is forgiving. A crowded bar, icy pavement, stairs, traffic, loud music, poor lighting, and fast-moving social demands are far less forgiving. A mildly impaired body may do reasonably well in a simple setting and much worse in a complex one. Alcohol reduces the margin for error, and the world often provides errors generously. This is why people can shift from seeming mostly fine to obviously unstable the moment the environment asks more of them. Sitting and talking is one thing. Standing, turning, walking through a crowd, finding a ride share and locating one's own scarf in a room full of coats is quite another. Fatigue makes all of this worse. If the brain is already tired, the systems supporting balance, attention, speech, and coordination begin from a weaker baseline. Alcohol then piles onto that. A person drinking late at night after a long day is not simply adding alcohol to a fresh and perfectly regulated nervous system. They're often adding it to a brain already asking quietly for sleep. This can magnify clumsiness, reaction time problems, and errors in judgment. It also helps explain why the same amount of alcohol can feel very different depending on when and how it is consumed. Biology is not happening on a clean laboratory table. It is happening inside a tired primate in shoes, usually after emails. There is an especially dangerous moment that sometimes occurs when people stand up after sitting for a while. Alcohol can affect blood vessel tone and contribute to drops in blood pressure when changing posture, especially in combination with dehydration or fatigue. The person rises, the world briefly tilts, balance is already impaired, and suddenly the floor has entered the discussion. Falls become more likely not only because the cerebellum is less effective, but because the whole cardiovascular and sensory situation is less stable. Injuries from alcohol are often treated as comic in stories until they are not comic at all. Bruises, broken bones, head injuries, cuts, accidents in bathrooms or on stairs, these all become more likely when fine control disappears. Speech and motion are also linked socially in a way that can intensify the situation. Once a person becomes visibly unsteady or begins slurring, other people react. Some become amused, some become protective, some become irritated. Some keep serving them alcohol because group judgment can be as unreliable as individual judgment once enough glasses are involved. The intoxicated person then has to navigate not only their own failing motor control, but the social consequences of displaying that failure. Shame or defensiveness may appear. A person may insist more strongly that they are fine precisely because their body has started making it hard to maintain dignity. Pride is not a stabilizing force, unfortunately. It does not improve vestibular integration. There is also something revealing about the transition from internal intoxication to visible intoxication. Early on, alcohol can be mistaken for emotional ease, confidence, sociability, or charm. Later, when the body loses finesse, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. Fine control is difficult to fake. The body becomes an honest witness against the mind's flattering narrative. That is often when people around the drinker realise the situation has moved beyond the pleasant beginning. The person no longer only sounds a little bolder, they move differently, they speak differently, the glass is lifted less cleanly, the chair is found with more effort. The rhythm of the whole person has changed, and rhythm is exactly what alcohol disrupts. Much of coordinated movement depends on rhythm, not musical rhythm in the sense of dancing well or badly, though that certainly enters the picture too, but neural rhythm. The timing with which signals are sent, corrected, suppressed, and integrated. Alcohol disturbs these rhythms by altering inhibitory and excitatory balance, slowing processing, and reducing precision across networks. The result is not merely weakness, it is poor timing. Poor timing in the limbs, poor timing in the voice, poor timing in the eyes, poor timing in the response to the world. The body becomes less elegant because the brain is less synchronized. This is particularly visible in gait, the pattern of walking. A sober walk is generally efficient, even when a person is tired or absent-minded. Under alcohol, gait often widens. Steps may become less even. Turning is less smooth. The person may compensate by planting the feet more broadly, slowing down, or moving with exaggerated caution. This wide-based, uncertain style of walking is a classic sign of cerebellar involvement. It is the body trying to keep stability with poorer balance information and less precise correction. People often joke about walking it off, but the walk itself is one of the places where alcohol is already writing its signature. What is most troubling about the loss of fine control is that it does not always arrive in proportion to how harmless the person feels. Someone may feel only pleasantly buzzed while already being impaired enough to misjudge a curb, drop a glass, or drive badly. The gap between felt state and actual motor function is one of alcohol's recurring dangers. It allows impairment to become real before it becomes fully believed, and because movement is tied to independence, dignity, and safety, that gap matters in practical ways. The person who believes they can manage alone may already be less able to do so. Longer-term heavy drinking can also affect movement beyond the temporary intoxicated state. Repeated alcohol exposure can damage nerves and affect cerebellar function over time, contributing in some people to chronic balance problems, tremor, unsteady gait, and other motor difficulties even when sober. But even in the shorter term, nights of repeated drinking can create a pattern where the body is regularly asked to operate under poor coordination, poor sleep, dehydration, and rebound instability. The nervous system is remarkably adaptable, but it does not enjoy being repeatedly turned into a poorly tuned instrument. It is worth noticing too that this stage often arrives while the person is becoming sleepy, whether they admit it or not. Alcohol's effects on movement and speech often overlap with growing sedation. The body is not only less coordinated, it is also becoming heavier, slower, more inclined toward drowsiness. Eyelids lower. Posture softens. The person may feel warmly tired and interpret that as the body beginning a natural path towards sleep. But alcohol's sleepy pull is deceptive. It can make someone feel ready for bed while also preparing to interfere with the very architecture of sleep itself. In that sense, the body's growing heaviness is not a promise of good rest. It is simply another sign that the nervous system is being pushed towards suppression. So when alcohol reaches the stage where balance, speech and motion are visibly changed, the body is not betraying the person. It is revealing the truth of the brain state. The cerebellum is struggling. The vestibular system is less reliable. Motor timing is less precise. Speech coordination is weakening. Reaction time is slowing. Posture and gait are becoming harder to regulate. The person who once felt merely lighter and looser is now moving through the world with diminished fine control, and the cost of that loss can range from awkwardness to real danger depending on what the world asks of them next. And what the world often asks next is sleep. People grow tired, go home, collapse into bed, and imagine that the body's about to recover. Alcohol has made them drowsy after all. It has slowed the signals, softened the mind, made movement clumsy, turned speech thick, and wrapped the whole evening in a kind of chemical heaviness. Surely now comes rest. But this is where alcohol performs another one of its misleading little turns, because the same substance that helps many people fall asleep more quickly is also quietly preparing to give the brain a much poorer night than it seems to promise at first. There is a moment, often toward the later part of an evening with alcohol, when the body begins to feel unmistakably heavy. The earlier lift has faded into something softer and slower. The room seems dimmer even if the lights have not changed. Words take more effort. The idea of standing up and doing anything purposeful begins to feel ambitious in a way it did not an hour ago. Eyelids lower without asking permission. A chair becomes more appealing than any conversation. The bed, if one is lucky enough to be near it, starts to feel like the most reasonable destination in the world. It is very easy in that moment to believe that alcohol is helping the body move naturally toward rest. It feels like sleep is arriving early and generously. It feels like a shortcut to recovery. But the brain does not treat alcohol-induced sleepiness the same way it treats real readiness for sleep. The drowsiness alcohol creates is not identical to the natural process that builds across the day, the slow accumulation of sleep pressure that leads the brain toward restorative cycles. Instead, alcohol is chemically pushing the nervous system towards sedation, while also interfering with the systems that organize sleep into something genuinely restorative. This is one of the quiet contradictions of alcohol. It can make falling asleep easier at first, while making the sleep that follows less effective, less stable, and less renewing. To understand why, it helps to think about what sleep actually is. Sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness. It is an active, structured process. The brain cycles through different stages across the night. There are lighter stages, deeper slow-wave sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep, often called REM sleep, which is associated with dreaming and important aspects of emotional processing and memory. These stages are not random. They follow a pattern. Early in the night, deeper slow-wave sleep tends to dominate. Later, REM periods become longer and more frequent. The balance matters. Each stage plays a role in restoring the brain, regulating mood, consolidating memory, and maintaining overall cognitive function. Alcohol disrupts this pattern in several ways. One of its immediate effects is to increase inhibitory signaling in the brain, particularly through systems like GABA. This can make the brain feel quiet enough to drift into sleep more quickly. A person may lie down and find that they fall asleep faster than they would have without alcohol. That part is real. It is one of the reasons people sometimes use alcohol as a kind of informal sleep aid. But the ease of falling asleep is only one part of the story. What matters more for rest is what happens after sleep begins. As alcohol continues to be metabolized through the night, its effects on the brain change. Early on, it can suppress REM sleep, reducing the amount of time the brain spends in that important stage. This may not be obvious to the sleeper, because they are not watching their own sleep architecture unfold like a late-night documentary. But the brain notices. REM sleep plays a role in processing emotional experiences, integrating memory, and maintaining certain aspects of mental health. When it is reduced or delayed, the night's sleep becomes less balanced. Then, as blood alcohol levels begin to fall, the brain can enter a kind of rebound state. The inhibitory influence of alcohol fades, and the nervous system, which has been pushed in one direction, begins to shift back. This can lead to increased arousal, lighter sleep, and more frequent awakenings during the second half of the night. A person may not fully wake each time in a way they clearly remember, but sleep becomes more fragmented. The smooth cycling through stages is disrupted. The brain moves in and out of sleep more erratically. What began as a quick descent into sleep can turn into a restless, uneven night. This fragmentation is one reason people often wake feeling less rested after drinking, even if they spent a reasonable number of hours in bed. Sleep duration is not the same as sleep quality. 8 hours of interrupted, poorly structured sleep can leave a person feeling more tired than 6 hours of stable, well-organized sleep. Alcohol tends to reduce the stability of sleep. It makes the night less continuous, less deep in the right ways, and less supportive of the processes that restore mental clarity and physical energy. There is also the matter of breathing. Alcohol can relax muscles in the throat and airway, which can worsen snoring and in some individuals contribute to sleep-disordered breathing or exacerbate existing sleep apnea. When breathing becomes less stable during sleep, oxygen levels can fluctuate, and the brain may partially awaken to correct the problem. These repeated micro-awakenings further fragment sleep. The person may not remember them, but the body does not receive uninterrupted rest. The night becomes a series of shallow recoveries rather than a sustained period of restoration. Hydration and body temperature play their roles as well. Alcohol can increase fluid loss and affect temperature regulation, which can contribute to discomfort during the night. Waking up thirsty, sweating, or feeling uncomfortably warm or cold can interrupt sleep further. The body is not simply lying peacefully in a state of recovery. It is managing a substance, processing its effects, adjusting internal systems, and dealing with the consequences of altered physiology. All of this leads to a common experience. A person falls asleep quickly, sometimes even gratefully, and yet wakes up feeling tired, heavy, or mentally dull. The assumption may be that they did not sleep long enough or that something else is wrong, but often the issue is that the sleep itself was compromised. The brain did not move cleanly through the stages it needed. It did not spend the right amount of time in deeper restorative phases. It did not maintain stable cycles. The night looked like rest from the outside, but functioned more like a disturbed process internally. The impact on memory is especially interesting here, because we have already seen that alcohol disrupts memory formation during the evening itself. Sleep is supposed to help consolidate what was learned or experienced during the day, strengthening memory traces and integrating them into longer-term storage. When sleep is disrupted, this consolidation is less effective. So alcohol interferes with memory twice, first by impairing encoding during waking, and then by disrupting consolidation during sleep. The result can be a particularly poor record of the evening, not only because it was not well recorded in the first place, but because the brain did not get a clean chance to stabilize what little was recorded. Mood is also affected. Poor sleep is closely linked to irritability, anxiety, and reduced emotional regulation the next day. When alcohol disrupts sleep, it sets the stage for a morning that feels less steady. The person may wake with a sense of unease, low mood, or heightened sensitivity to stress. This is sometimes interpreted as a hangover being purely physical, a matter of dehydration or headache. But the emotional component is often tied to sleep disruption and the brain's altered state after a night of poor quality rest. The same substance that seemed to soften emotional edges in the evening can contribute to sharper edges the next day. There is also a subtle learning effect here. If a person regularly uses alcohol to fall asleep, the brain can begin to associate sleep onset with the presence of alcohol. Over time, this can make it harder to fall asleep without it, not because the brain truly needs alcohol to sleep, but because it has learned to expect it. This can lead to a pattern where alcohol becomes part of the nightly routine, not for pleasure, but for perceived necessity. The person may say they cannot sleep without it, when in reality their sleep system has become conditioned around its presence. Meanwhile, the quality of sleep remains compromised, and the cycle continues. Tolerance can play a role as well. With repeated use, the initial sedating effect of alcohol may feel less strong, leading some people to consume more in order to achieve the same sleepy feeling. But increasing the dose often worsens sleep disruption rather than improving rest. The brain is being pushed further away from its natural rhythms, not closer to them. The person may fall asleep even faster, but the night becomes even more fragmented, and the next day's fatigue becomes more pronounced. It is also worth noting that alcohol's effect on sleep can vary depending on timing. Drinking close to bedtime tends to have a stronger impact on sleep architecture than drinking earlier in the evening, and allowing more time for metabolism before sleep. But even earlier drinking can still influence sleep, especially if the amount is significant. The body does not reset instantly when the glass is empty. Alcohol remains in the system for hours, and its effects on brain function extend into the night. From the outside, alcohol-induced sleep can look peaceful. A person lies still, breathing slowly, perhaps even more deeply than usual. But stillness is not the same as restoration. The brain is not necessarily cycling through its stages in the way it needs. It may be quieter in some respects and more unstable in others. The appearance of rest can be misleading, much like the early calm of drinking itself. This is one of the reasons alcohol can create a cycle of fatigue. A person drinks in the evening, falls asleep quickly, wakes feeling less rested, feels more tired during the day, and may be more likely to seek relief or relaxation again in the evening. The initial appeal of alcohol as a way to unwind becomes entangled with the ongoing experience of not quite feeling restored. The brain is caught between the immediate relief of sedation and the longer-term cost of disrupted sleep. It is also important to remember that natural sleep pressure builds throughout the day through mechanisms involving substances like adenosine. This pressure is part of the body's internal timing system, helping guide when sleep should occur and how deep it should be. Alcohol does not replace this system, it overlays it with sedation. When the sedative effect fades, the underlying sleep pressure and circadian rhythms may not align smoothly, leading to awakenings and difficulty maintaining sleep. The brain is not following its usual script. It is improvising under altered conditions. People sometimes describe alcohol as helping them switch off. There is some truth in that, in the sense that it can reduce the intensity of conscious thought and make it easier to disengage from the day. But switching off is not the same as switching into a healthy sleep state. It is more like dimming the lights in a room without actually organising the space. The clutter remains. The processes that would normally tidy things up during the night are not working as well. In the morning, the lights come back on, and the room is not as orderly as it might have been. This distinction becomes clearer when comparing alcohol-induced sleepiness with the natural transition into sleep. Under normal conditions, the brain gradually reduces arousal, body temperature shifts, melatonin levels rise, and the body moves into sleep in a coordinated way. The transition is part of a larger rhythm tied to the day-night cycle. Alcohol interrupts this rhythm. It forces part of the transition while disrupting others. The result is a kind of uneven entry into sleep followed by an uneven night. Over time, repeated disruption of sleep can have broader effects on health. Chronic poor sleep is linked to a range of issues, including impaired cognitive function, mood disturbances, weakened immune response, and metabolic changes. When alcohol becomes a regular part of the evening routine, its impact on sleep can contribute to these longer-term patterns. What began as a tool for relaxation can quietly undermine one of the body's most important restorative processes, and yet, in the moment, the appeal remains understandable. The tired brain welcomes the sensation of heaviness. The bed feels inviting. The day is over. The person may feel that they are finally letting go. It is a deeply human moment, the desire to rest, to soften, to drift away from the demands of wakefulness. Alcohol steps into that moment and offers a version of it that feels immediate and accessible, but the version it offers is incomplete. It helps the body fall asleep, but it does not help the brain sleep well. By the time morning arrives, the difference becomes clearer. The person may wake feeling less refreshed than expected, more sluggish, perhaps with a lingering sense of unease. The brain that was chemically quieted has not fully repaired itself. The systems that regulate mood, memory, and attention are not as steady. The night has passed, but it has not done its usual work. This sets the stage for another shift, because as alcohol leaves the system, the brain does not simply return to its original state without consequence. It often reacts, sometimes in ways that feel like the opposite of the initial calm. Restlessness, anxiety, irritability, and a subtle sense that something is not quite right can begin to appear. The same substance that softened the mind earlier can leave it feeling sharper in a less pleasant way later, and that transition is where the story moves next. There is a quiet shift that often happens after alcohol begins to leave the body, and it is not always expected. The earlier part of the experience may have felt soft, warm, even helpful in a modest way. Thoughts slowed, tension eased. The edges of the day seemed less sharp. It was easy to believe, at least for a while, that the brain had found a simpler, calmer state. But as the night moves on or the morning arrives, something else begins to take shape. The calm does not simply fade back to normal. Instead, many people notice a kind of rebound, a return of restlessness, unease or anxiety that can feel sharper than what was there before. The same mind that was quieted becomes unsettled. The same body that felt heavy becomes alert in an uncomfortable way. It can feel confusing, even unfair, as though the brain has changed its mind about what it wants to feel. This rebound is not random. It reflects the way the brain responds to being pushed in one direction and then released. Earlier, alcohol increased inhibitory signaling and reduced excitatory activity, shifting the nervous system toward calm and sedation. But the brain is not passive in the face of these changes. It is an adaptive organ. When its balance is altered, it begins adjusting in real time, trying to maintain stability. If inhibition is pushed higher than usual, the brain may begin compensating by reducing sensitivity to those inhibitory signals or by increasing excitatory drive. These adjustments are not perfect and they are not instantaneous, but they begin while alcohol is still present. As alcohol levels fall, the chemical push toward inhibition weakens, but the brain's compensatory adjustments do not disappear at exactly the same moment. The result can be a temporary imbalance in the opposite direction. Inhibition is now lower relative to where it was during drinking, and excitation may be higher relative to baseline. The nervous system shifts from being dampened to being more active than usual. This is the rebound effect. The calm gives way to restlessness. The quiet mind becomes a busier one. The ease becomes a kind of agitation. People experience this in different ways. For some, it feels like anxiety returning, but with more intensity. Thoughts may come faster, less organized, harder to settle. The mind may revisit conversations from the night before, replaying them with new clarity and less forgiving interpretation. What felt amusing or harmless at the time may now feel questionable or embarrassing. This is partly psychological, because sober reflection brings different judgment, but it is also physiological. The brain is in a more excitable state, and that makes worries more vivid and harder to dismiss. For others, the rebound shows up as physical restlessness. The body feels slightly on edge, not fully at ease. There may be a sense of inattention, a subtle unease that is difficult to name. Sleep, if it was interrupted earlier, may now feel even more elusive. The person may wake in the early morning hours with a racing mind and a body that refuses to settle back into rest. The quiet heaviness of earlier has been replaced by something lighter, but more uncomfortable, like trying to rest on a surface that will not quite hold still. This shift can be especially noticeable in people who already carry some level of baseline anxiety. For them, alcohol's initial calming effect may feel particularly appealing because it reduces something that is already present, but the rebound can also be more pronounced. The brain's return to a more excitable state may amplify existing patterns. The person who drank to quiet their thoughts may find those thoughts returning with more urgency. The contrast between the earlier calm and the later restlessness can make the rebound feel even sharper. It is important to understand that this does not mean alcohol creates anxiety out of nothing. Rather, it changes the timing and intensity of how the brain experiences it. The earlier phase can mask or reduce anxiety, and the later phase can reveal it more strongly. This creates a kind of cycle where alcohol appears to solve a problem temporarily, only to contribute to it later. The brain learns the immediate relief more easily than it learns the daily discomfort, which can make the pattern difficult to recognize in the moment. Sleep disruption plays a role here as well. As we saw, alcohol can fragment sleep and reduce its restorative quality. When the brain does not receive stable, high-quality sleep, its ability to regulate mood is impaired. Emotional responses become less balanced. Small concerns can feel larger, patience is reduced. The threshold for stress becomes lower. When this is combined with the rebound in neural excitability, the result can be a morning that feels mentally unsettled, even if nothing in the external world has changed. There is also a chemical component to this emotional shift. Neurotransmitter systems that were affected by alcohol do not simply return to baseline instantly. GABA activity, which was enhanced during drinking, may now be relatively reduced in its effectiveness. Glutamate activity, which was suppressed, may rebound with increased influence. Dopamine systems, which contributed to the earlier sense of reward, may now be less active, leading to a drop in mood or motivation. The brain is moving through a kind of recalibration, and during that process it can feel out of balance. This can create a peculiar emotional landscape. The person may feel tired but unable to rest, calm in one moment and uneasy in the next, reflective but also unsettled. The contrast between how things felt earlier and how they feel now can be striking. It is not uncommon for people to describe a kind of emotional dip after drinking, even when the evening itself seemed pleasant. The brain is no longer under the influence of the substance that created the earlier state, but it has not yet fully returned to its usual equilibrium. One of the more subtle effects of this rebound is how it shapes memory and interpretation of the previous evening. As the brain becomes more alert and less inhibited, it may begin reviewing what happened with a different perspective. Conversations that felt smooth may now feel awkward. Decisions that felt reasonable may now feel questionable. This is partly the result of sober judgment returning, but it is also influenced by the brain's heightened sensitivity during the rebound phase. The person is not only remembering differently, they are feeling differently about what they remember. This can lead to what people sometimes call hangover anxiety, or a sense of regret that feels disproportionate to the events themselves. The brain, now more excitable and less buffered, may amplify concerns. It may search for mistakes, replay moments, and focus on uncertainties. Even if nothing particularly negative occurred, the feeling of unease can persist. This is one of the less discussed aspects of alcohol's effect on the mind. The discomfort is not always tied to actual events. It can arise from the brain's altered state during the rebound. Hydration, nutrition, and overall physical condition can influence how strong this effect feels. Dehydration can contribute to physical discomfort, which in turn can affect mood. Low blood sugar can make the brain more irritable or less stable. Fatigue from poor sleep compounds everything. The brain is not operating in isolation. Its emotional state is shaped by the condition of the body as a whole. After drinking, several systems may be slightly out of balance at once, and that combination can make the rebound feel more pronounced. Over time, repeated cycles of drinking and rebound can create a pattern that the brain begins to anticipate. The person may come to expect that after a night of drinking there will be a period of discomfort. This expectation can itself influence how the experience is perceived. The brain is very good at learning patterns, and once a pattern is established, it can become part of the overall experience. The anticipation of the rebound can make it feel more certain, more defined. In some cases, this pattern can lead to a kind of loop. A person feels anxious or unsettled, drinks to reduce that feeling, experiences temporary relief, and then encounters a rebound that brings the feeling back. The brain learns that alcohol can provide short-term relief, even though it contributes to the longer-term cycle. This does not happen to everyone, and the intensity varies widely, but the underlying mechanism is the same. The brain responds to immediate changes more readily than to delayed consequences. It is also worth noting that not all rebound effects are dramatic. Sometimes they are subtle, a slight edge to the mood, a bit more irritability, a sense of being less centered. These small shifts can accumulate, especially if drinking is frequent. The person may not connect them directly to alcohol because they do not feel extreme, but over time the pattern can become more noticeable. The brain spends more time in states of imbalance, moving between sedation and rebound rather than maintaining a steady baseline. The body's stress systems can be involved as well. Alcohol can influence hormones related to stress, and as it leaves the system, these systems may become more active. This can contribute to feelings of tension or alertness that do not match the person's desire to rest. The body is, in a sense, recalibrating, but the process is not always smooth. It can feel like being gently pushed from one state to another without quite landing comfortably in either. What makes the rebound effect particularly important is that it changes the overall experience of alcohol beyond the immediate moment. The evening may feel pleasant, but the full experience includes what happens afterward. If the brain regularly moves from calm to restlessness, from ease to unease, the pattern becomes part of the relationship with alcohol. The substance is no longer just associated with relaxation, it is associated with a cycle. Understanding this does not require seeing alcohol as purely harmful or purely helpful. It requires seeing it as something that changes the brain in ways that unfold over time. The first phase is not the whole story. The rebound is part of the same process, just later in the sequence. The brain that was gently slowed is now adjusting, and that adjustment can feel like a swing in the opposite direction. For some people, this realization changes how they think about drinking. The question becomes not only how the evening feels, but how the next morning feels, and how the two are connected. The brain does not separate them. It experiences both as parts of a single process. The calm and the restlessness belong to the same arc. And as this arc repeats, the brain begins to adapt in deeper ways. The systems that regulate inhibition, excitation, reward and stress do not simply reset after each cycle. They learn, they adjust. Over time, these adjustments can change how alcohol feels, how much is needed to achieve the same effects, and how the brain responds when alcohol is not present. This is where the story moves next, into the quieter but more significant changes that develop with repeated exposure, as the brain gradually reshapes itself around the presence of alcohol. There is a quiet kind of change that does not announce itself in a single evening. It does not arrive with a sudden shift or a clear moment where something feels dramatically different. Instead, it unfolds gradually over repeated experiences in small adjustments that the brain makes almost without asking permission. At first, alcohol may feel strong, noticeable, easy to detect in the body and mind. A single drink softens the edges. 2 drinks bring a clear shift. The pattern is easy to recognize. But over time, something begins to move beneath the surface. The same amount feels a little less powerful. The same drink does not quite reach the same place. The brain, which is always adapting, has begun to adjust. This is what people call tolerance, though the word can sound more deliberate than the process actually is. The brain is not consciously deciding to tolerate alcohol in the way one tolerates a long meeting or a mildly disappointing sandwich. It is responding biologically to repeated exposure. When a substance repeatedly alters the balance of neural activity, the brain tries to restore that balance. It does not prefer to remain in a state that is constantly pushed in one direction. If inhibition is regularly increased and excitation reduced by alcohol, the brain begins to compensate. It may reduce the sensitivity of inhibitory receptors, making them less responsive. It may increase excitatory activity or strengthen excitatory pathways. These changes do not happen all at once, and they are not identical in every person, but they follow a general principle. The brain resists being pushed too far in any direction for too long. This adaptation is, in many ways, a strength of the nervous system. Without it, people would not be able to adjust to new environments, learn new skills, or recover from changes. The brain is built to maintain stability in a changing world. But when the change comes from a substance like alcohol, the same adaptability can create a different kind of outcome. The brain learns to function in the presence of alcohol, and in doing so, it becomes less responsive to its immediate effects. At first, this may seem helpful. A person who once felt very affected by a single drink may now feel more in control. They may believe they have become better at drinking, more capable, less sensitive, more experienced. Socially, this can even be praised. The ability to drink more without obvious impairment is sometimes treated as a sign of resilience or strength. But from the brain's perspective, something else is happening. The same amount of alcohol is producing less noticeable effect because the brain has changed how it responds to it. This can lead to a subtle shift in behavior. If one drink no longer creates the same feeling, the person may have two. If two no longer feel the same, they may have three. The goal is often not to drink more for its own sake, but to reach the familiar state that used to arrive more easily. The brain remembers the earlier experience, the calm, the lift, the softening, and it seeks that state again. But because tolerance has developed, reaching that state requires more alcohol. The person may not think of this as increasing consumption. They may think of it as adjusting to what feels normal. At the same time, the brain's adaptations do not only affect how alcohol feels during use, they also influence how the brain feels when alcohol is not present. If inhibitory systems have become less sensitive and excitatory systems more active in response to repeated alcohol exposure, then in the absence of alcohol, the brain may be slightly more excitable than before. This does not necessarily mean severe withdrawal or dramatic symptoms. In many cases, it is more subtle. A person may feel a bit more restless, a bit more on edge, a bit less able to relax without alcohol than they used to be. The baseline has shifted slightly. This shift can be difficult to notice because it happens gradually. There is no single day when the person wakes up and feels completely different. Instead, the brain's resting state moves little by little. The contrast between drinking and not drinking becomes more noticeable. Alcohol feels like a clearer way to reach calm or ease, not because it has become more effective, but because the brain's unassisted state has changed. This is where adaptation begins to influence habit. The person is no longer only responding to the immediate effects of alcohol, they are also responding to the difference between their current state and the state alcohol can create. If that difference grows, the motivation to drink can increase. The brain has learned not only that alcohol changes how it feels, but that its own baseline has shifted in a way that makes alcohol more appealing. Tolerance can also affect how impairment is perceived. A person with higher tolerance may appear less obviously affected by alcohol at a given dose. They may speak more clearly, move more steadily, or maintain social composure longer than someone with lower tolerance. But this outward appearance does not mean that the brain is functioning normally. Reaction time, judgment, attention, and memory can still be impaired even if the person feels and appears more in control. The brain has adapted to the presence of alcohol, but the underlying effects on neural processing remain. This can create a dangerous illusion. The person believes they are less impaired because they feel less impaired. They may take on tasks or risks they would not have considered earlier in their drinking history. Driving, making important decisions, engaging in complex activities all may seem more manageable than they actually are. The brain's self-assessment systems have adapted alongside everything else, and they are not always reliable indicators of true function. There is also a social dimension to this. People often compare their drinking to others, using visible behavior as a measure. If someone can hold their alcohol and remain composed, they may be seen as more capable. But tolerance is not a protective shield. It is a sign that the brain has changed in response to repeated exposure. The person may be able to drink more before appearing intoxicated, but they are also likely consuming more alcohol to reach a similar subjective state. The total impact on the brain and body can be greater, even if it is less obvious. Over time, these adaptations can become more pronounced. The brain systems for inhibition and excitation continue to adjust. Reward pathways may become less responsive to the same amount of alcohol, reducing the initial lift and making the experience feel flatter. This can lead to further increases in consumption as the person tries to recapture the earlier effects. At the same time, the negative consequences such as poor sleep, rebound anxiety and cognitive impairment may become more frequent or more noticeable. This gradual shift can change the relationship a person has with alcohol. What began as an occasional way to relax or socialize can become a more regular part of daily life. The brain's expectations adjust. The timing of drinking becomes more predictable. Certain moments of the day may begin to feel incomplete without it. This is not necessarily a conscious decision. It is the result of repeated patterns shaping neural pathways over time. It is also important to recognize that tolerance is not uniform across all effects of alcohol. A person may develop tolerance to some aspects, such as the feeling of relaxation or sedation, while remaining sensitive to others, such as memory impairment or motor coordination. This uneven adaptation can make the experience even more confusing. The person may feel less affected in some ways while still being significantly impaired in others. The body also adapts beyond the brain. The liver can increase its capacity to metabolize alcohol to some extent, though this adaptation has limits. Increased metabolism can contribute to the feeling that alcohol is being processed more quickly, but it does not eliminate its effects. The brain's adaptations remain central to how alcohol is experienced. As these changes accumulate, the pattern of drinking can become more deeply ingrained. The brain's reward systems, inhibitory systems, and excitatory systems are all involved. The person may find themselves thinking about alcohol more often, not necessarily in an intense or overwhelming way, but as a regular option for changing how they feel. The association between alcohol and certain states, relaxation, social ease, relief from stress, becomes stronger. At the same time, the rebound effects we discussed earlier can also become more noticeable. As the brain adapts, the contrast between drinking and not drinking can increase. The periods without alcohol may feel less comfortable, more restless, more uneven. This can reinforce the cycle, making alcohol seem like a necessary part of maintaining balance, even though it is also contributing to the imbalance. It is worth emphasizing that this process is not identical for everyone. Genetics, environment, stress levels, mental health, social context, and many other factors influence how tolerance develops and how the brain adapts. Some people may experience these changes more quickly, others more slowly, and some may not notice them strongly at all. But the underlying principle remains. The brain responds to repeated exposure by adjusting its systems, and those adjustments change how alcohol feels and how it fits into a person's life. What makes this stage particularly subtle is that it often feels normal. There is no clear boundary where a person can say, "This is where things changed." Instead, the familiar becomes slightly different, and the different becomes familiar. The brain adapts quietly, and the person continues, often without noticing how much the baseline has shifted. This quiet adaptation sets the stage for the next phase of the story. As tolerance increases and the brain systems continue to adjust, the relationship with alcohol can move beyond simple habit or preference. In some cases, the brain begins to rely on alcohol to maintain its balance, and the absence of alcohol can produce more noticeable discomfort. This is where the concept of dependence begins to emerge, not as a sudden event, but as the continuation of the same adaptive processes, becoming more pronounced and more difficult to ignore. There is a point, not always obvious and rarely marked by a single moment, where the relationship between the brain and alcohol begins to change in a deeper way. What started as something optional, something that could be taken or left depending on mood, setting, or curiosity, can begin to feel less optional. The shift is not usually dramatic at first. It is not a sudden realization that something has taken hold. It is quieter than that. The brain, after repeated adaptation, begins to behave as though alcohol is part of its expected environment. And when that expectation is not met, something feels off. Dependence does not mean that a person has lost all control or that they drink constantly without pause. It means that the brain has adjusted to the presence of alcohol in a way that makes its absence noticeable and, in some cases, uncomfortable. Earlier, alcohol pushed the brain toward inhibition, toward calm, toward a reduction in activity. The brain responded by adjusting its own systems, reducing sensitivity to inhibitory signals and increasing excitatory activity. Over time, this new balance becomes the brain's working state when alcohol is regularly present. When alcohol is then removed, the compensations remain, at least for a while. The inhibitory influence that alcohol provided is gone, but the brain is still tuned as though it should be there. The result is a nervous system that is more active than usual. Excitation outweighs inhibition. The mind can feel faster, less settled, less able to rest. This is the beginning of withdrawal, though it does not always appear in severe or dramatic forms. In many cases, it begins as something subtle, a feeling of unease, difficulty relaxing, trouble sleeping, a slight tremor in the hands, a sense that the body is not quite comfortable in its own skin. This discomfort can be easy to misinterpret. A person may think they are simply stressed, tired, or dealing with the ordinary pressures of life. They may not immediately connect the feeling to the absence of alcohol, especially if their drinking has been moderate or routine rather than extreme. But the brain is responding to a change in its expected state. It has adapted to function with alcohol, and without it, the balance is temporarily disrupted. The emotional side of this can be particularly noticeable. Anxiety may feel sharper, more persistent, harder to quiet. Irritability can appear without a clear cause. Small frustrations may feel larger than they should. The person may find themselves more reactive, less patient, more easily unsettled. This is not simply a psychological reaction. It is tied to the brain's altered chemistry. The systems that regulate mood and stress are operating in a different balance, and that balance favours activation rather than calm. Sleep, once again, plays a role. Without alcohol, the brain may struggle to fall asleep as easily as it did when sedation was present. The person may lie awake longer, thoughts moving more quickly, the body less willing to settle. Even when sleep comes, it may feel lighter or more fragmented at first. Over time, the brain can readjust and sleep can improve. But in the early stages of withdrawal, rest can feel elusive. This lack of sleep then feeds back into mood and cognition, making the overall experience more difficult. Physical symptoms can accompany these changes as well. Mild withdrawal may include sweating, restlessness, headaches, or a sense of internal agitation. In more pronounced cases, symptoms can become more severe, including significant tremors, nausea, elevated heart rate, and in extreme situations, confusion or seizures. These more serious symptoms are typically associated with heavy and prolonged alcohol use, and they reflect a deeper level of dependence where the brain and body have undergone more extensive adaptation. It is important to recognize that dependence exists on a spectrum. Not everyone who drinks regularly develops severe withdrawal symptoms, but even mild forms of dependence reflect the same underlying principle. The brain has changed in response to repeated exposure, and those changes influence how it functions without alcohol. The absence of alcohol is not neutral. It is a shift away from a state the brain has come to expect. One of the most challenging aspects of this stage is how it shapes behavior. If the absence of alcohol leads to discomfort, then drinking can begin to feel like a way to restore balance. The person is no longer drinking only for pleasure or relaxation. They're also drinking to relieve the unease that arises when they do not drink. This can create a cycle where alcohol is both the cause of the imbalance and the temporary solution to it. The brain learns this pattern quickly. It notices that discomfort decreases when alcohol is consumed. The relief may not be as strong or as pleasant as the early experiences of drinking, but it is noticeable, and relief, as we have seen, is a powerful form of reinforcement. The brain begins to associate alcohol not just with reward, but with normalization. It becomes something that brings the system back to a state that feels more stable, even if that stability is temporary and dependent on continued use. This is where the experience of alcohol can change significantly. The early gentle lift may become less prominent. The initial reward may feel muted. Instead, the primary effect may be the reduction of discomfort. The person drinks and feels less anxious, less restless, less unsettled. But the feeling is not the same as the earlier sense of ease. It is more like returning to baseline from a state of imbalance. This shift can be difficult to notice because it happens gradually. The person may still describe drinking as relaxing, but the nature of that relaxation has changed. At the same time, tolerance continues to play a role. The amount of alcohol needed to achieve relief or calm may increase. The brain's adaptations mean that the same dose produces less effect, and the person may adjust their consumption accordingly. This can lead to patterns of drinking that are more frequent or more intense than before, not necessarily by conscious choice, but as a response to how the brain now functions. Social and psychological factors also interact with this process. Drinking may be tied to routines, relationships, or environments that reinforce the behavior. Stress, loneliness, or habit can all make alcohol more appealing, especially when the brain is already primed to respond to it. The person may find themselves reaching for a drink in situations where they did not before, not because they are seeking excitement, but because they are seeking stability. It is also worth noting that the brain's ability to adapt works in both directions. Just as it adjusts to the presence of alcohol, it can adjust to its absence over time. Withdrawal symptoms, whether mild or severe, do not last indefinitely. The brain can gradually restore its balance, recalibrating inhibitory and excitatory systems, re-establishing more stable patterns of activity. But this process can take time, and the initial period of adjustment can be uncomfortable enough to make it difficult to sustain. This is one reason why support can be important when someone is trying to reduce or stop drinking after a period of dependence. The brain is going through a process of change, and that process can benefit from stability, care, and sometimes medical guidance, especially in cases of more severe withdrawal. The discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the brain is recalibrating after having adapted to a different state. There is also a psychological dimension to dependence that goes beyond the immediate physical effects. Alcohol may become part of how a person understands themselves or their routine. It may be tied to identity, to social roles, to ways of coping with emotion. Letting go of it or even reducing it can therefore feel like more than a physical adjustment. It can feel like a shift in how one lives and relates to the world. This can make the process more complex because it involves not only the brain's chemistry but also patterns of behavior and meaning. Despite this complexity, the underlying mechanism remains consistent. The brain has been adapting to alcohol, and those adaptations have changed how it functions. Dependence is not a sudden event. It is the continuation of the same processes we have been following, becoming more pronounced and more influential. The brain that once resisted the presence of alcohol now incorporates it into its expectations, and the absence of alcohol reveals how much that expectation has taken hold. This stage of the story is often the most difficult to face, because it challenges the idea that alcohol is simply a choice that can be made or unmade without consequence. The brain's adaptations mean that the choice is now interacting with a system that has changed. But it is also a stage where understanding can make a difference. Recognizing what is happening, how the brain has adjusted, and why the discomfort arises can help make sense of the experience. And as the brain continues to adapt, whether through continued use or through reduction and recovery, the long-term rhythm of a person's life begins to reflect these changes. Alcohol is no longer just an occasional influence. It becomes part of the ongoing pattern, shaping mood, behavior, sleep, and cognition over time. This is where the story widens, moving beyond individual moments into the broader question of how alcohol fits into the long rhythm of a life. By the time we reach the end of this story, alcohol can seem both simpler and stranger than it first appeared. Simpler, because once you look closely enough, its effects are not mystical at all. They belong to chemistry, signaling, adaptation, sleep, memory, reward, and the ordinary rules of a nervous system trying to stay alive and balanced while a small molecule keeps interfering with the plan. Stranger, because those rules produce an experience that can feel deeply human and deeply misleading at the same time. A drink can seem to offer calm while building tension later. It can seem to offer connection while quietly weakening judgment. It can seem to offer sleep while reducing rest. It can seem to soften the mind while also making memory fragile, movement clumsy, and emotion less well guided. It can feel like a companion in the moment and a cost in the morning. And because both parts are true in their own time, alcohol earns a very particular place in human life. It is easy to think of alcohol only in separate scenes. The party, the dinner, the lonely drink after a long day, the celebration, the bad decision, the quick sleep, the anxious morning. But the brain does not store these as unrelated little postcards. It learns from patterns. It links states together. It notices what came before relief, what followed tension, what softened fear, what worsened sleep, what made social life easier, what made the next day harder, what became routine, what became expected. Over time, the effects of alcohol are not just about any one evening. They become part of a rhythm, and the long rhythm matters because human life is mostly made of repeated things. Repeated mornings, repeated evenings, repeated habits, repeated shortcuts, repeated forms of comfort, repeated ways of dealing with stress, silence, company, and fatigue. That is why the most important question about alcohol is often not whether it is good or bad in some absolute sermon-like way. The more interesting question is what role it begins to play over time. Does it remain occasional, specific, light in its footprint, something that passes through life without taking up too much space in the brain's expectations? Or does it begin to colonize certain hours, certain moods, certain transitions? Does it become the thing that signals that work is over? The thing that makes conversation feel possible? The thing that quiets sadness? The thing that turns down loneliness? The thing that says sleep may begin now? The thing that takes the edge off being oneself? Because when a substance begins taking on too many jobs, it starts changing the architecture of a life, not only the chemistry of an evening. One reason this happens so quietly is that alcohol does not usually begin as an obvious destroyer. It begins as a persuader. It often enters through ordinary doors: shared laughter, social ease, ritual, curiosity, taste, celebration, relief. It may feel, especially at first, as though it is helping a person participate more smoothly in life, rather than retreat from it. For some people it can feel like a social solvent, loosening what is stuck. For others it feels like a sedative for the private mind, reducing the noise that daily life has piled up. For others still, it becomes associated with reward, adulthood, romance, pleasure, weekends, dinner, music, permission. The meanings around it are rich and varied, which makes the biology harder to see. People rarely think, I am now modulating inhibitory and excitatory signaling while teaching my reward system that this hour belongs to a chemical helper. They think, finally, I can relax. And yet, the brain keeps a stricter record than the social story does. It keeps track of what repeatedly changes state. It learns that a substance arrives and tension drops. It learns that the substance arrives and self-consciousness loosens. It learns that the substance arrives and feelings become easier to express, or easier to escape depending on the person and the night. It learns that sleep begins faster, even if sleep quality worsens later. It learns that stress can be interrupted, that loneliness can be blurred, that boredom can be decorated, that celebration can be amplified, that grief can be muffled for a while. The learning itself is not the problem. The problem is that the brain learns these things faster than it learns the delayed cost. It remembers the immediate state change vividly. The disrupted sleep, the memory gaps, the anxious rebound, the slow adjustment of tolerance, the shift in baseline comfort, all of that belongs to later parts of the curve. Human beings, like most living creatures, are often easier to teach with immediate relief than with delayed consequence. In the long rhythm of life, that means alcohol can begin to shape not only experience but expectation. One no longer merely drinks in certain moments. One expects drinking to belong to certain moments. Friday evening means a drink. A difficult conversation means a drink afterward. A lonely hotel room means a drink. Dinner out means a drink. Holiday gathering means a drink. Writing session, date night, airport, celebration, disappointment, awkward reunion, grief, success, watching television after work. The brain can start assigning alcohol a seat at more and more tables. The seat may look modest, it may look deserved, it may look culturally normal. But as the number of roles increases, the substance becomes woven more tightly into the structure of emotional regulation. That weaving has consequences even when things never reach the most dramatic end of the spectrum. Not every life touched by alcohol becomes visibly ruined. Not every person who leans on it becomes dependent in a severe and obvious way. But subtler changes can still matter enormously. A person may sleep a little worse for years and forget what fully restful evenings feel like. A person may become less practiced at managing social discomfort without chemical help. A person may slowly train themselves to treat private tension as something to blunt rather than understand. A person may begin to live with more rebound anxiety, more emotional unevenness, more memory fog, more subtle fatigue than they realize, because the pattern has become familiar. Familiarity is a powerful disguiser. What repeats often begins to feel like personality, fate, or adulthood, rather than a modifiable pattern. This is especially true because alcohol often sits so close to normal culture. Many things that profoundly change the brain arrive with warning signs, stigma, or obvious danger signals. Alcohol often arrives with glasses chosen for aesthetics, soft lighting, menu pairings, seasonal traditions, and jokes about needing one after Tuesday. None of that changes the molecule. It simply changes how politely it enters the scene. The brain, however, is not especially impressed by atmosphere. It responds to ethanol. It responds to concentration, timing, repetition, and learned association. Whether a drink is consumed in crystal or paper, under fairy lights or fluorescent misery, after a triumph or before a collapse, the brain meets the same chemical story each time. That story is cumulative in a subtle way. One night of drinking may not seem especially important. Even several may not. But life is long, and repeated small shifts can become large patterns. A person who regularly disrupts deep sleep and REM sleep may, over years, know themselves as just a little more tired, a little more emotionally brittle, a little less sharp in the morning. A person who repeatedly uses alcohol to reduce anxiety may slowly narrow their confidence in their own ability to settle without it. A person who experiences repeated memory fragments may become accustomed to evenings that are partly missing, and with that, partly missing from the development of the self that memory normally helps create. A person who drinks through stress may never quite discover what other forms of regulation might have grown stronger if given more practice. Life becomes organized around the path of least immediate discomfort, and the brain, being efficient if nothing else, begins to favor that path. There is also something important to say about freedom here because alcohol is often tied to the idea of freedom. Freedom from tension, freedom from rules, freedom from social stiffness, freedom from overthinking, freedom from the day's pressure, and in the short term it can feel like that. But freedom has a peculiar enemy, and that enemy is dependency on a narrow tool. The more one particular substance becomes necessary for calm, sociability, sleep, celebration, or escape, the smaller the range of free states becomes. A person may still choose, certainly, but the nervous system begins nudging more strongly toward a familiar route. Real freedom in a brain is not simply the ability to turn oneself down at will. It is the ability to move across different states: stress, rest, joy, sorrow, company, solitude, without needing one fixed chemical bridge every time. Alcohol can feel like freedom while quietly making those bridges narrower. This is one reason the question of what alcohol changes is really a question about alternatives. Not alternatives in a preachy sense, not a finger wagging toward herbal tea and moral purity, but in the practical neurological sense. What other ways does a person have to come down from stress, to enter sleep, to tolerate awkwardness, to celebrate without disinhibition, to grieve without numbing, to feel pleasure without sedation, to connect without blunting judgment, to survive a difficult evening and still remember it clearly afterward? A life becomes broader when it contains more than one route into relief, more than one route into joy, more than one route into rest. A life becomes narrower when one route begins to dominate because it is immediate, familiar, and neurologically persuasive. And yet none of this means alcohol is powerful because people are weak. It is powerful because brains are learnable. They learn what works in the short term. They learn what reduces pain fast. They learn what is paired with belonging, ritual, and reward. They adapt to repeated inputs. They compensate, then depend, then call those arrangements normal. This is not shameful. It is biological. What matters is not pretending the mechanism is mysterious. It is seeing it clearly enough to decide what role one wants the substance to have in the long shape of a life. For some people, that role may remain genuinely small, occasional, bounded, socially pleasant, not especially central, not doing too much psychological labour. For others, the role may grow large enough that the substance begins to organise mood, evenings, sleep, self-expression, and recovery in more serious ways. The crucial thing is that the size of the role is not always obvious from the inside while it is growing. Because the brain adapts gradually, the person often notices only once the substance has become woven into more places than expected. The drink that was once just for celebration is now also for decompression, then for sleep, then for social courage, then for taking the edge off mornings or difficult feelings or the absence of itself. The range expands quietly. There is also the long emotional truth that alcohol can preserve certain problems by interrupting them too quickly. If every lonely evening is softened immediately, loneliness may remain unexplored and therefore unchanged. If every social fear is chemically reduced, social confidence may never fully grow under sober conditions. If every sleepless mind is sedated rather than retrained, the sleep system may never fully relearn steadiness. If every grief is blurred at the first edge, some of grief's work may remain suspended. The substance can make a life more bearable in the short term while delaying the deeper adaptations that would make it sturdier in the long term. Relief is not the same thing as resolution, though the brain understandably loves to confuse them. At the same time, life is not a laboratory, and people do not move through it as tidy case studies. They drink in context of joy, culture, pain, family history, tradition, economics, trauma, love, isolation, celebration, boredom, and simple human imperfection. A person may reach for alcohol because it genuinely feels like the most available tool they have at that moment. That is worth meeting with honesty rather than contempt. The brain is always trying to regulate, and sometimes it reaches for what is nearest. But compassion should not require confusion. Something can be understandable and still costly. Something can feel kind in the moment and still change the rhythm of a life in ways that deserve attention. When people reflect later on alcohol's place in their lives, they often talk not only about what it did on the nights they drank, but about what it quietly took or delayed around the edges. Better sleep, clearer mornings, trust in memory, confidence in driving one's own emotional system without help, a wider repertoire of comfort, more stable mood across the week, fewer anxious rebounds, less dependence on an external switch to move from one state to another. Sometimes what alcohol changes most in the long run is not one dramatic event but the texture of ordinary days. The body a little less rested, the mind a little less even, the evenings a little less fully chosen than they seemed. And still, the story is never entirely bleak, because brains remain adaptable in more than one direction. The same nervous system that learns alcohol can also unlearn patterns, soften associations, widen its roots into regulation, recover sleep architecture, restore sensitivity, and build different expectations. Memory can become clearer, evenings can acquire new rhythms, anxiety can be met by tools other than sedation. Social ease can be practiced rather than poured. Rest can return through real sleep rather than chemical heaviness. None of that is instant, and none of it is achieved by moral slogans alone, but it is possible because the brain that changed under repetition is also capable of changing again under new repetition. That may be the quietest and most useful thought to carry from all of this. Alcohol changes the brain, yes, but the brain is not a static object once changed. It is a living system. It records patterns, but it can also revise them. It adjusts to what is repeated, and that means new repetitions matter. Nights without alcohol matter. Different ways of coming down matter. Different ways of tolerating emotion matter. Different ways of sleeping, connecting, celebrating, pausing, and enduring matter. The long rhythm of a life is not built from one decision. It is built from recurring ones, and brains are listening the whole time. So when we ask what alcohol really changes, the answer is not only the chemistry of one evening, or the behaviour of one version of a person after midnight. It changes how the brain balances calm and excitation, how it sleeps, what it remembers, how it learns reward, what it begins to expect, how it handles absence, how it calibrates stress, and, over enough time, what feels normal. It changes the routes by which relief is reached. It changes the relationship between discomfort and action. It changes whether rest is borrowed or earned. It changes whether memory stays whole. It changes whether the mind begins to trust itself without assistance. And because these things are woven into daily life, the change is not only chemical, it becomes temporal. It becomes part of the long rhythm by which a person moves through weeks, seasons, relationships, and years. Tonight, though, in this quieter hour, perhaps the most useful way to hold all of that is simply this. The brain is always listening to what we repeat. It is always learning what comes after stress, after joy, after loneliness, after fatigue, after celebration, after silence. It is always preparing for the pattern it expects next, and somewhere in that gentle, stubborn, very human machinery lies the possibility of choosing what rhythm we want to teach it. One evening at a time, one softened habit at a time, one clearer morning after another, as the mind keeps moving forward and learning what to carry with it.